G'day podcasters, welcome back to Season 6 of True Blue Conversations with your host Adam Bloom, the author of Easy Target, now available at adambloom.com.au. 8 years ago, after returning from 3 tours of Afghanistan and then gaining experience and education in financial planning, Warren Loudon teamed up with fellow veteran Dave Vaughan and started Loudon and Vaughan Private Wealth, founded with the underlying belief that every person matters and every dollar counts, providing comprehensive tailored financial advice and wealth management services for you and your family. Loudon and Vaughan will guide you towards your financial goals with integrity and transparency. Whether you're planning for retirement, investing for the future, or managing your family's wealth, they've got you covered. Visit loudonandvaughan.com.au or call 02 9538 2704 to book a meeting with Warren today.
G'day, welcome back to True Blue Conversations. I'm Adam Bloom. Today, I have a very special guest, and I've been wanting to get this guest on for a while now, and he's got an amazing story of just true resilience, never giving up, and not letting the cards that were dealt to him in his early years defy who he is. And he has only thrived from the cards that he had dealt. And he joined the army at 16. And he joined the British paratrooping 3. Is that right, Andy? Para?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, the Parachute Regiment 3 Para. Yeah.
So he's currently a firefighter in the UK, and very cause very close to my heart because I'm a fellow firefighter. So Andy Williams, mate, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
No, it's an absolute pleasure, Adam. Thanks for inviting me on. I've been looking forward to coming on for a while now. So yeah, it's a real privilege to talk to you.
Thanks, mate. And I should add in a recent author as well, best-selling author. So we'll get that off, and we'll talk about the book later on. But Andy, before we get into you joining the military, let's go back to, as I said, I've set the scene. Let's go back to a young Andy and talk about your life growing up, because you didn't really have a normal upbringing. So let's talk about a young Andy.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And when I reflect back, it didn't feel unorthodox at the time to me, because I didn't really know anything different. It was only as I got older that I learned more about how I was feeling as a young lad. But when I was very young, it didn't seem out of the ordinary to me, because I didn't know anything different. So I'm the youngest of 3 siblings, and my brother and my sister are much older than me. My brother's 14 years older, my sister's 12 years older, and the family we come from North Wales, just a small village on the North Wales coast, and it's a beautiful place to live, but there's not a great deal going on there. It very much has that small town mentality, I suppose. And my father was, his family and my grandparents, they all come from a mining community. As you'll be aware, Wales was infamous for mining for many years. And so when he was growing up in the late 40s, that's what the men did. They went down the pit and they mined for coal. And my father got out of that at a young age and joined the Merchant Navy. He became an engineer, and for all of his adult life, he worked abroad. And that was just where the opportunities were for him. And I completely understand. I completely get it. And he worked all over Asia and the Middle East. And for all of my life, especially my upbringing, he lived in Saudi Arabia. And so I've never actually lived with him. He's always worked abroad. And back in North Wales, there was my brother and my sister and my mother. And my mother never wanted to go and live out in Saudi Arabia. And the relationship was very much a distant one. And we'd only see my dad at that time maybe once a year. But he had a very good job over there and he was earning good money. And I'm told by my brother and sister that we lived in a comfortable house when we were very young. And when I was 3, my mother had always had a problem with alcoholism, and I witnessed it firsthand as I got older. And I think my sister and my brother were really veterans of that alcoholism, because their memories of her very very different from my own in the early years. And she was very violent when she'd had a drink. She would lock my brother in a cupboard. They would be beaten quite severely. And she was dependent on alcohol. When I got to the age of 3, my brother joined the Royal Marines at the age of 17. So he left the family home, and it left my sister and myself with my mother. And when I got to the age of 3, one day, my mother decided to walk out the house and leave us and never come back. And it was as literal as that. She just left the house one day, and we never saw her again, or for years. And so it left my 15-year-old sister and me alone in North Wales. And obviously I don't have many memories at this time because I was so young, but I do remember us flying out to Saudi Arabia to live with my dad. And I've asked my dad about this since, and he just said that there was no work prospects in North Wales. He had 3 kids, although one had left to join the Royal Marines. He had a really good job in Saudi Arabia that he felt like he needed to protect, because it was his only chance of earning a decent wage. And so we lived out there, and initially the plan was for both my sister and I to go to an international school in Saudi. And we lived on a western compound in the middle of the desert, just outside a town called Al Jubail in eastern Saudi Arabia. And my memories in those very early years are fond ones, really. I would spend the days in the swimming pool. There wasn't much on the compound, but there was an outdoor pool, and there was a video rental shop, and there was a convenience store. And when you're that age, it's just one big adventure. And I'd spend the days riding my bike around the compound and playing in the pool and playing with the other kids there from all over the world, really, that where their fathers worked on these large ethylene plants in the desert. And then, I suppose, understandably, my sister got to an age where she was 16, and she missed the UK and she missed North Wales, because, especially back then, as a Western young woman, there was nothing for her to do. You weren't even allowed outside of the compound gates without a headscarf as a bare minimum, or an abaya. And so, quite understandably, she wanted to come back to the UK, where all of her friends were, all of her support network, I suppose, from her friends. And so it was decided that my sister would become my full-time surrogate mother at the age of 16, and we would both fly back to North Wales. And again, this was the late 80s. So I often think back that whether was it the right decision at that time. And I try and put myself in my father's shoes. And I can see it from both sides because she was very young, but anybody that knows my sister will tell you that she is fiercely independent. She's stubborn and very strong-willed. She's a tough cookie, and so I think that she definitely would have played a huge factor in me going back to North Wales with her, and that both my father and my sister have told me since that she was very clear that no, I will look after Andrew. We'll stay together and we'll go back to North Wales. So that's what we did, mate. I was nearly 6, and my sister was 16, just turning 17, and so we lived in a small ground floor council flat. The flat actually belonged to my nine, my grandma. So nine is Welsh for grandma, and my dad had bought the flat off my nine, and it was nothing to it. It was a very small 1-bedroom flat, but it was good enough for my sister and I. And so we lived in the flat. I wouldn't say it was a particular rough area compared to your big cities, but the flat complex it wasn't the greatest place to live. There were drug users in the building, and I've got memories of being very young, and often finding syringes lying around outside when I was playing. But my sister did the best that she could to make the flat clean and tidy and comfortable, and she did a great job. But one of the things I remember is I could never shake this feeling of at school. I didn't understand why I didn't have a mum or a dad, and I probably didn't realize the impact that it was going to have on me later on in life, because although me and my sister have such a close relationship, and as I'll get onto, she's actually saved my life in more ways than one. It was always a brother and a sister relationship. She was playing the role of my surrogate mother, but it was always a brother relationship. So there was no affection. There was no, I'd never cuddle her. We would never tell each other that we loved each other. It was always brother, sister, and that was all I knew, really. And so I grew up there, mate. I went to school in North Wales, a place called Prestatyn. And my sister and I, it was just my sister and I. We didn't have anyone else in North Wales. We had an auntie and an uncle, but we didn't have any real relationship with them. I remember when I was very young that occasionally they may babysit me for a night or a day whilst my sister went to work. So she sacrificed an awful lot at a young age. She didn't finish school. She'd come out of school at 15, and she never went back to school. And she became a full-time mum, and my dad would send money over to her. And that was us. Yeah, we lived in the flat, and I went to school. And she was so young, and it definitely got the better of her at times. She certainly had a temper that matched my mother's at times. And I suppose, not surprisingly, she married at a young age. So she married just after her 19th birthday, and she met a local man, and we ended up moving onto an estate with this new guy, and they married. And again, I always had that feeling of I felt like I was in the way, because they were now starting this new life together. And there I was, a little brother, just, almost like an inconvenience. So they married, and they had a daughter, but it was a very explosive and quite often violent relationship. Obviously, my sister didn't have the best start in life either, and they would have really explosive arguments in the house where things would get smashed, and quite often it'd be taken out on me if they were in a bad mood. And it wasn't a very nice household to be in. And it's only when I look back now, I actually developed tics as a young kid. And I used to blink repetitively, squint and grunt. And it's only now when from trying to learn from some of the things that happened in the past, that it was my own way of dealing with the stress and the feeling of fear a lot of the times. So like I said, Adam, the relationship didn't last long. They were only married a couple of years, and my niece, who was two and a half at the time, I was 10. The three of us moved back into the old council flat, and we lived there. And my niece and I shared a single bed. It was only one bedroom, and my sister slept in the lounge on the sofa. And that was us for pretty much until I joined the military.
So you mentioned so you mentioned that, like, mate, it's just wild. Like that is just wild to like you had such a as you said at the start of the podcast, like in your eyes it was a normal upbringing, but in the scheme of things, mate, it's not a normal upbringing.
Yeah. It's as I said, I didn't know it at the time. That was just all I knew, and I never remember missing my mother. But I just always had that feeling of like I wasn't wanted. So I probably had quite low sort of self-worth, and it actually helped me later on in life, because I always had this idea in my mind that I had to prove myself and I had to be the best at everything to feel wanted, I suppose. And so we moved back into the flat, and from when my sister and I moved back to North Wales until the age of about 15, I would fly back to Saudi Arabia every year, and I'd spend the whole summer in Saudi. And my education probably wasn't taken as seriously as it should, because I would miss the last few weeks at school. I'd always miss the first week back at school, and I would spend it in Saudi with my dad, although he was still working. And then quite often my father and I would fly to Cyprus, and my sister would meet us there, and we would have a week or so together, and then we would go our separate ways. And yeah, I absolutely love Saudi. I think now that I've always had a fascination with the Middle East and traveling and experiencing cultures different from our own, and that's probably where it came from, because it was a world that was so different from North Wales. I mean, at that time in the early 90s, there was still public executions in the cities. Not that we ever witnessed any, but you'd see the crowds of people gathering around. It was very medieval, very restrictive, but as a young kid, it was just a one big adventure. And I remember that my dad had a good friend, and he was a Brit, and he had been in the Territorial Army. before he went out to Saudi Arabia. And I remember him taking me out into the desert when I was about 10, and he had a pistol, and he used to let me fire the pistol with live rounds into the desert because there's no one around. It was, it was really good, really good. And he handed me the first military book I ever read, and it was a book called Bravo 20 by a guy called Andy McNabb. And I suppose that gave me an initial interest in the military. And he was a SAS veteran that was taken hostage in the Gulf War. And so growing up, I knew from a very young age that I wanted to be a soldier. And my brother would come back from the Royal Marines maybe once a month, and I was always really excited to see him. And yeah, at a young age, I knew I wanted to join the military. But I started boxing at a young age because I think the boxing coach was a great guy. He's no longer with us, but definitely looked up to him as a role model, I suppose, a bit of a father figure. And it was something that I needed desperately at that time. And so I boxed at a young age from around 10, 11. And that really gave me my first experience of working hard, just developing that resilience and that grit at a young age. And I put everything into it. And I played rugby at school, but I boxed quite a lot. And it all helped me when I ended up joining the military. So if I fast forward to when I was like 14 or 15, when I was 14, my sister met somebody else, and they're still married now. And he's a great guy, really, really good guy, and brother-in-law. And so she used to spend more and more time with this person, and it basically left me in the flat on my own. So quite often we would only see each other in passing, and my sister she'd put food in the cupboards for the week, and then I wouldn't see her for a week or so. And from the age of 15, really, I was more or less living on my own. And so I didn't go to school. I would stay in the flat, or one of my best friends who ended up joining the Royal Marines over here, we would bunk off school and we would go and train. And when so many other kids at that age were knocking about and getting into trouble on the streets, we were both just obsessed with joining the military. And that was really our only chance of escaping North Wales. And so we would bunk off school, and I would make up these elaborate training exercises on the beach. And the North Wales beach is bloody cold, and it's not the most appealing. It's not the most appealing shorelines. But we would meet up at 6, 7 o'clock in the morning, and we would put rocks into a Bergen, and we would run up and down the beach. We would jump into the sea and do press-ups and sit-ups in the sea, and it was really good. And every time we were trying to make it more extreme and more difficult. And I was still boxing at this time as well. And so at 16, I was finally old enough to leave North Wales and join the military. So in the UK, you can go to what they call an Army Foundation College at the age of 15 and a half, and you'll spend a year at the college, and you'll gain some qualifications. You'll start learning about how to be a soldier. But I completely get the reason for that, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to wait and then just go straight into the depot as early as I could. And that was 16 and 9 months. And my sister was happy enough to sign the letter to say that she gave her consent. And I'm very grateful for her doing that. But it was really, I was really very well prepared for going into the depot, even though I was very young. And I think that was because I lived on my own a lot of the time. When I went to depot, I could already cook for myself. I could already iron my clothes. I could polish my boots. I could maintain a house, do washing. I was very domesticated. And when I went to the depot, I helped a lot of the older lads, teaching them how to iron and make their bed. And so, I was very independent. I was very grateful of that, and it definitely prepared me for depot at a young age, because I have a son who's 18 next month, which find it so hard to believe he's nearly 18. But I could never in a million years imagine him joining the military. He just, in my eyes, he's still a boy to me. He's still he's still my little boy. And I don't know. We were definitely with different motivations, and he's very good at what all the stuff that he's into, but he's just so young.
But that was you, mate. That was what you were.
I joined it.
That was you.
Yeah, yeah.
It's funny. It's funny how it works. Yeah, it's funny how it works, mate. Like, it's just, and that's the thing. Like, and that's what I'm trying to highlight to people is that, really for you, as before we jumped on, it was really like it was an escape joining the military. But you mentioned that your brother joined the military, and that was really a driving factor. But did you have any other relatives that had served before him, or was he really the first relative that had actually joined the military before yourself?
Yeah, absolutely, mate. Sorry, I just lost you for a second there. Yeah, and like so many other people that join the military, it is a way of a way of escaping the town and seeing the world. It was exciting because until that point, although I was traveling to Saudi, I didn't really know anybody outside of the town where we lived, because we never had a car growing up, so we walked everywhere. And then all of a sudden, I was in Para Training Depot, and it is just a melting pot of lads from all over the UK, all over the cities and the rough estates, from Glasgow to London, and all of the Commonwealth. We had some Aussies in the platoon, some lads from New Zealand, South Africans, Fijians. So it was really good at a young age, just mixing with all these people. But I was obviously still very young. The oldest in our platoon was 28, and I was 16. So I actually ended up one of the events that you have to do, where you have to demonstrate controlled aggression, and you have to fight someone for a minute with boxing gloves on. And I ended up getting paired against the oldest person in the platoon as the youngest person. And yeah, so it's 16. I joined, and the training is up in North Yorkshire, which, if anyone's not familiar with it, it's right up in the north of England. It is very bleak, and it's raining sideways 9 months of the year, and there's lots of hills. It's a perfect training ground for anyone joining the infantry. But joining the paras, although the town is a huge garrison town where a lot of the infantry training happens there, but the paras, we have our own separate camp along with the Gurkhas, and then there's everybody else. And that was just because of the intensity of the training. And it was, and still is, arguably, outside of SF, of course, the toughest selection process in the UK.
So just talk talk me through that, Andy, because you didn't want to join a regular, like you didn't go regulars. You wanted that chat. Where did the love to become a para come from for you? Like, was it that because you didn't, as you mentioned, it's the toughest away from special forces. So what made you choose para?
Yeah, so my brother was in the Royal Marines, and initially I was going to join the Royal Marines, and on occasion my brother would take me down to the barracks when I was very young, and I would meet the lads. He would show me the weapon systems, and I thought, well, I'm going to join the Royal Marines. And he actually used to make money in the pubs from me because I was so fit. I have these memories of going into the pubs down in. He was based down in Plymouth, and he would say to the guys in the pub, "If my little brother can do more press ups than you, you owe me a drink." And so I have these memories of competing with men in the pubs when I was, a young teenager, and winning him drinks by doing press ups in the bar. And and I got to an age where I joined the Army Cadets at 13, and I suppose I started then learning about the army or the armed forces more widely. And then I suppose I didn't want to copy my brother. I don't want people to think, well, he's just followed in the same footsteps as his brother. I wanted to do my own thing and carve my own path in life. And I would obsess over these military books and magazines that I would collect at a young age. And one of the first things that stood out to me was the beret, because it's distinct from anyone else in the military, in the sense that it's maroon. And I thought parachuting is quite a cool thing to do. And the paras base themselves on being fit and being aggressive, parachuting over enemy lines, and being completely self-sufficient in everything that they do. And I thought that sounded more cool to me than being on a vessel or a boat and doing a beach landing. And I learned more about the training and the history of the regiment, from its formation during World War II, all the way through to North Africa, the Korean War, the Falklands, which is very famous for the paras, Mount Longdon and Goose Green. And I just thought, yeah, that is what I want to do. And I remember telling my brother, because I thought he was going to be disappointed in me for not wanting to be a Royal Marine. But he was nothing but supportive. I just I wanted to do my own thing, and I was, borderline. Not even borderline. I was absolutely obsessed with passing. There was no way I was going to fail that course, because it was my only option of escaping North Wales and actually, proving to people that, I am worthy of affection and making something of myself. And like I said, because I lived on my own and I had no one to go back home to, it was the perfect storm, really. I was so well prepared for it. And don't get me wrong, the training is 28 weeks initially, and it is really tough, but it's progressive.
So talk me through that, Andy. As a 16 and 9, nearly 17, like there's guys that are like adults that they're struggling, pulling off the course. Do you think, looking back now, do you think it was your upbringing of when you were a kid that made you so resilient to just keep pushing on over those 28 weeks?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely, because from the boxing training and the sessions on the beach that we were doing, I was so fit, so fit in everything, in all the. So you do a 3 day pre-selection before they even allow you to join the paras, just to show that you're fit enough to join. And everything I did, I was finishing first on the runs, the pull-ups. It's very well known that you don't have to be the most intelligent person to join the paras, but they make good soldiers because you're physically fit and you can follow orders, and that as a soldier, that's really important. And so I was in a good position when I started the training depot, and like I say, it's 28 weeks long, and it's progressive. And as away from the physical aspect of it and the discipline, there's also like there is in the fire service, the amount of information you need to retain is a lot. And again, probably being in the cadets helped with that, because I already had an understanding of the weapon systems that we use. I could map read. I had a few experiences of living in the field, basic first aid, so it probably helped me initially. But I do remember some of the guys struggling, and they would miss home, or they would just struggle with the routine of being in depot. And like I said, I didn't really feel like I was so young, and it was just one big adventure, really, at that young age. And the corporals, or the screws, as we'd call them, the training staff, you look up to them to an extent, because they are everything that you're aspiring to be. They've got their maroon beret, and they will have up to 10 years in a battalion. Most of them will have experience of operational tours. And until that point, I'd never met a para. I'd only read about them in books and magazines, and then they're there in person. And especially at a young age, you're so impressionable. And you look at these guys like, they're almost like gods. And you look at how they carry themselves, and how they organize their kit, and how they speak. And like with so many other units, that you almost have your own way of saying words, and fiercely proud as well of the regiment and its history. And so you're very brainwashed, really, at a young age. So I did definitely look up to them, and the army pretty much became my new family. And yeah, I loved it. I'd never wanted to go back to North Wales. So during the first few months, you're not allowed to leave the camp, and you'll work 7 days a week. But then after that, you would get the occasional weekend where you were released from duty, and you might have a weekend off. But I would just travel to different parts of the UK with the guys I was in the depot with, and just spend it in their hometowns, going out. And it was a great experience. And we started with, there was just over 50. There's about 52 people in the platoon when we started. When we actually passed out at the end of the training, there was about 16, 17 originals that had started that passed out, and that was either down to injury, because there were some really good guys, but they just picked up an injury and it just didn't happen for them, or just they didn't meet the standard. They didn't meet the standard, which is quite high. And so for the 28 weeks, you learn every aspect of soldiering, from living in the field and looking after yourself in the field, to emergency or pre-hospital care, fieldcraft, marksmanship principles, weapons, all everything that comes with being a soldier. And the training will accumulate to test week at the end of the training, which is called P Company. P standing for Pegasus. And I suppose it would draw similarities to the Navy SEALs Buds Week. It's like the Hell Week, if you like. Certainly not to the same extent, but it is a week of physical tests, and you will do 2 to 3 events per day, back to back, for a week. And each event you are scored, and there are some pass or fail events, and then others where you're scored. And then if you meet the criteria at the end of the week, you are told that you pass P Company. And it's don't get me wrong, is if you are physically fit, which you should be at that point, and you stay injury free, as long as you have the right mindset, you'll pass. And that just meant that what they want you to demonstrate is that when you absolutely have got nothing left, and you're tired and you're hurting and your body is shutting down, that you just have that stubbornness to keep going and not give up. And that's what they need to see. You don't even need to be the fittest in the platoon, but you just need to have that grit in you, that you're not gonna give up no matter what they throw at you. Because ultimately, if you give up on a training ground in North Yorkshire because you're a bit tired and you're a bit hurting, then you're no good to anybody on the battlefield. And that's what they really need to they really need to sieve out the ones that are not up to that standard. And sorry, Adam, were you going to say something?
Yes. Sorry, I was just going to say, so they weed out the ones that aren't up to and make the cut, mate. And for you, do you remember your first jump, and what was the feeling like when you first jumped? Because I know I've spoken to a few 3RAR guys over here, and they said, or Special Forces, and they said, nah, hated it. It was, we just did it because we were shit scared and we just did it. But for you, mate, being so young, did you have that fear of, you're jumping out of a plane, or talk me through that?
Yeah, so your parachute course, after the training depot, you'll get told which battalion you're going to join. There's 3 regular battalions, and then you'll straight away be put onto your parachute jumps course. And there were guys that had passed everything. They'd passed 6 months of horrific training, but they couldn't jump out that door. And what that meant was that they had to transfer to another unit. So for me at 16, I didn't really have that fear. No, don't get me wrong. Yeah, I did have that fear, but I was just so young, and I didn't really, you don't really have the same appetite for risk as you do when you're older. So the training is a month long, and you have to do a series of parachute jumps, and it builds up from a stick of 6, so 6 of you exiting the door, to a night jump where a whole platoon will exit the aircraft at the same time, either side. And it's a great course. It's done over in Oxford, and at the end of that course, you're given your parachute wings, and you get extra money for being parachute trained. But there were guys on the course who I had fortunately had the experience of traveling to Saudi and to Cyprus, but there were guys I served with. They'd never been on an airplane before. The first time they went up in an aircraft, they had to jump out of it. And I suppose that is just epitomizes everything of being a paratrooper. It is that that ability to mind over matter. No matter what your mind or anything else is telling you, you've been given an order, and that is to exit that aircraft at 1,000 feet. And whether you want to or not, you have to have that ability to switch off and just do it. I wouldn't say it never got any easier, because especially with tactical low level static line parachuting, there's a high injury rate, because the very nature of the parachuting is to exit the aircraft at low level, get to the ground as quick as you can with all of your weapons, your weapon and your kit, and operate. And so they compare the landing to jumping off a 12-foot wall. That's the impact. And then if you add on to that any complications with your canopy, the fact that you've got your Bergen, undulating ground and wind speed, there's a high injury rate. So fortunately, I never had any. I had some bad landings, but I didn't break anything. But yeah, I know guys that have been discharged out of the military with horrific landings. There's a high injury rate. Also, just the sheer number of paratroopers in the sky. So in terms of getting entangled to with another paratrooper, or what's called an air steal. So if your canopy goes over the top of somebody else, you'll steal their air, and that will cause their canopy to deflate. So it was an adrenaline fueled experience, but it was just a case of head down. You're shouting at yourself internally, and you just go for it. You just go for it.
And for you, mate, what was it like? So you do your para course, and like you get your wings, and proud moment. But talk me through that day that you finally passed and you were presented your maroon beret. What was that like, mate? Because you'd set a goal, and at a young age, you'd passed what is arguably one of the toughest selections away from Special Forces. Talk me through that day, mate. A proud moment for you, I reckon.
It was. It really was. And when we marched off the parade square, the song of the Parachute Regiment is by Wagner, and it's Ride of the Valkyries. And they have the Parachute Regiment band there. And I had my dad kit flew over from Cyprus. So at this point, he'd retired, and he lived in an apartment in a small villa in Cyprus. My sister was there. My brother had now left the Royal Marines, but he was there, and it was the proudest moment of my life, because I thought, well, that's it. I've made it now. In my mind, I will have a 22-year career in the Parachute Regiment, and I just, coming from a small town in North Wales, I just overwhelmed with being proud, and I was still only 17, and so you are told which battalion that you will go to out of the 3 regular battalions, and I always wanted to go to. So there's no difference between the battalions. It all depends on, they'll rotate through roles within the brigade. So you'll have a battalion that's in a training role. You'll have a battalion that is they're immediately ready to deploy anywhere in the world at a moment's notice. They might have 24 hours or more to deploy, and then you'll have another battalion in reserve, and they'll be doing training exercises, working with other units from the military. So we quite often work with the 101st Airborne Division, or the French Foreign Legion, or anywhere in the world. And so I always wanted to go to the 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, so 2 para. And that was just because one of the PTIs, the physical training instructors in the depot, he took a real shine to me, and I really looked up to him more than anybody else. And he came from 2 para, so I thought I want to be in 2 para. And unfortunately, he was like killed in Afghanistan. But at that time, 2 para were deployed to South Omar in Northern Ireland, and so I couldn't go because I was 17. And you don't really have an option anyway. You talk about it with the instructors, but ultimately you get told where you're going. And I ended up in 3 para, and they're based down in the southeast of England. 2 and 3 para were based there at separate barracks, and then 1 para were based in Dover. And at that time, we all 3 battalions are the same, and it all depended on the requirements of the brigade. And so I joined 3 para at 17, and at that time, there wasn't much going on in the world. So before I joined the military in 2001, I remember watching the planes go into the Twin Towers, and in my immature mind, I realised it was such a significant event, but I definitely wasn't mature enough, or I didn't have the understanding of how significant that was going to be on my military career. But I got to the battalion at the beginning of 2003, and there wasn't much going on, and all the senior guys mostly had just done back-to-back tours of Northern Ireland, and there were sergeant majors who had only been to Northern Ireland, but they had a full career and never fired a round in anger or been engaged by an enemy. And through no fault of their own, that was just the geopolitics of the world at that time, if you like. And there were some of the guys had been to Bosnia and Sierra Leone, but not everybody. It was only a small contingent. And that was how the British Army trained for conflict in those early years. Before we went to Iraq, it was very much a Northern Ireland type training. And so I got to the battalion in 2003, and then it was announced that the US and coalition forces were going to go into cross the border and go into Iraq. And it was an exciting time for the battalion because they were going to deploy to the desert, and it potentially was going to be quite significant, and everybody was hoping for it to kick off because as a soldier, everybody, that's what you want to do. You want to put yourself and test yourself. And unfortunately for me, because I was 17, I wasn't able to deploy with the battalion, and I was kept back on rear guard at 17, and we just had to stag on like guard duty for the camp, and we would carry out training. And there was a bunch of us there, and it was guys that were 17, there were guys that were injured or had maybe like an ongoing court case, and we stayed back at camp while the main battalion deployed to Iraq. And I was absolutely gutted to miss out, because there I was, I just completed the training, the first big deployment the battalion had done in years, and I wasn't able to go, but there's just nothing I could do. And the guys I was with, as they were turning 18, they were getting sent out a few days later. But that deployment just didn't happen for me because they returned before my 18th birthday. So, unfortunately, there's just nothing I could do. But after that deployment, it was a busy time for the battalion, and we deployed every year on operations up until I left the paras. So initially, I joined the boxing team, and it wasn't through choice. Because of my background and because I was so young and fit, I was pushed in that direction. Well, I wasn't pushed. I was told I was going to be boxing. And the first year in battalion, I was part of the boxing team, and so you don't wear any military clothing. You just cut around in a tracksuit and train and fight. And we had separate times to go into the cookhouse. We lived in a separate accommodation in the barracks, and it was really good. And we had a phenomenal team. The team actually, we won the Army Boxing Championships, and 3-Para went on to win it for the next decade. Out of every unit in the whole of the British Army, and it was tough training, and we had some guys that were ex-pros. We had some excellent coaches, and it was good. It was a good experience. But after a year, I wanted to do a bit of soldiering because I'd missed out on Iraq. I'd spent a year boxing, and because I was boxing, I didn't really have the opportunity to integrate into the platoon. I started off in a B company, which is just a rifle company, and so I joined the platoon just before the next deployment, which was to Northern Ireland, and that was my first operational deployment, and I just turned 18. So the Northern Ireland campaign, or Operation Banner, as it was known, it was coming to a close, and it was by no means as high risk as it was a couple of decades earlier, but there was still a lot of sectarian violence and political tension going on. And there was still a very risk of it was very well known that there was an intention to snatch soldiers, and there was reports recently of kneecappings, and it was still a very dangerous place to operate. And so we went out there for what's termed the marching season. And the marching season has deep historical and cultural roots in Northern Ireland. It happens every year, and it was always a time of political tension and unrest. And so our aim really was just to support the police service throughout the marching season. And it involved riot training, public disorder training. And it was a different side of soldiering that I didn't experience anything like that since that deployment, because it was a very different environment to operate in, because where we were operating, the people looked like us, they spoke like us, the streets looked the same as the streets that we grew up on, and it was a very different deployment. But also the riots and the demonstrations, because it was very personal. It was riot control, batons and shields, and it was very personal and in your face, as opposed to the threat that came later with small arms and improvised explosive devices. So we spent 4 or 5 months in Northern Ireland for the marching season, and other than there was a couple of situations where it got quite intense during riots, but other than those demonstrations, it was relatively uneventful. There were strict curfews in place, so we were allowed to go out in the day if we weren't working, but there were no-go areas, and we would have intelligent briefings, and we would go out on patrols on the streets, and then we would attend the riots or the marches. And there was one occasion where we were given an area of operations that was probably too vast for our company strength, and the the demonstrators and the writers, they closed in on us, and we were encircled by an angry mob, and they were throwing volleys of petrol bombs, and they'd already snatched pieces of equipment out of vehicles, and it was very violent. And they'd got into the back of one of the snatched Land Rovers, and they were, we were really fighting to put them back. And the police service in Northern Ireland really sort of saved our skin on that occasion, because we were soldiers ultimately. Pierce and I were well equipped and very experienced in that kind of fighting, and they were able to help us with water cannons and just their tactics. But it was a good deployment, Adam, and it was a good chance to embed myself with the platoon, and do a little bit of fighting and save some money and just concentrate on being a soldier.
So you come back from that, mate, and as you say, being 18 and exposed to that, like, because I'm guessing at this point you'd been exposed to, the occasional fighting in, like, growing up and that, but this was like riots, wasn't it? Like, these were actual genuine riots, and for you experiencing that at such a young age, what was that like?
Yeah, it was. They were full scale riots, and there was a very risk of someone getting snatched and hurt, and we were under no illusions that if they managed to get one of us out of our baseline, it would be very difficult to get that person back. So for the first time in my life, I remember being in an environment where I thought that there's people here in this community that they don't want us to be here, and they want us dead. Really, they want us dead, or they want to cause us serious harm. So it definitely upped the ante at 18, because you're patrolling the streets with a live weapon for the first time, and I don't think any of us really knew at that age what we were doing. We're just following orders. We're following orders, and we're trying to prove to the rest of the battalion that we're good soldiers, and we're doing the best that we can. So, but there was a very real threat, and we were very aware of that. And that was the first time I'd experienced anything like that. And as I said, it was unusual in the sense that we were operating a place that was very different. It was exactly the same as the places we'd grown up. And I didn't know any of the historical roots of the troubles in Northern Ireland. We had a rough idea, but we were just so young. So it was an experience that was a good foundation for the deployments that were to come.
Yeah, and we'll get into that now, of, like, as you say, and a lot of veterans that I've had on, they said the same thing as you, like they had East Timor, and so all baby steps to get you into where we'll talk about Iraq and Afghanistan. And same for you, like, first time they put live ammunition into their weapon, and all baby steps to then, well, what would become the normal, and we're going to get into that now. So you come back from your first operational tour, and now Iraq's kicking off and going hectic. And let's talk about this trip. But what in 2005 you deployed to Iraq?
Yes. So following the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003, the US and coalition forces went into Iraq, and during that deployment, there was a lot of heavy fighting going on in the north of Iraq, in places like Fallujah and Baghdad, because that was a Sunni, Muslim Sunni stronghold, and we've started to see the emergence of different insurgent groups, all with their own agenda. we were deployed to the south of Iraq, which was predominantly Shia, all the way down to the Kuwaiti border. So we were based at the airport in Basra. So it was, again, it was very exciting to the battalion to get back into the desert. And it was an environment that I was familiar with from my childhood to some extent. You know, I was used, I knew what the heat was going to be like, and being in the desert. And I was excited to go there as a soldier. And we were there very much to assist the security forces there and conduct atmospheric patrols of the desert. And at this time, I just joined a specialist machine guns platoon within 3 Para. So after a couple of years of being we'd call it a gravel belly, so just like a grunt soldier, you're given the option to specialize, and they run specialist cadres every year or every couple of years, and that might be you might want to go into the reconnaissance unit or the patrols unit. You might want to become a sniper, or we have the mortar platoon, the anti-tanks. And going back to the PTI who inspired me in the training depot, he was in the machine guns platoon. And I thought it sounded pretty cool. The support company, as it were, consists of the mortar platoon, the anti-tank missile platoon, and the heavy machine guns platoon. And the support company, they always had they had something about them. So they were generally more senior private soldiers, and discipline was relaxed a little bit. So we tended to have big sideburns, longer hair. It wasn't so much of an emphasis on your uniform and polishing your boots. There was a big drinking culture, and it was just generally quite a cool company to be in. And I thought I liked the idea of operating a big, heavy 50 cal machine gun. So it consisted of a 50 cal machine gun, both on a vehicle and on a tripod, and a general purpose machine gun. So that was our role, and the machine gun was also used in an SF mode, which is on a tripod. And you'd fire bursts of 20 to 30 rounds, and we would basically support the rifle companies during an attack, during a battalion attack. So I successfully passed the cadre and was selected to be in the machine guns platoon, and we went out with one of the other companies to the airport, or just outside the airport in Basra, and we operated on Wimmick Land Rovers, and it just a stripped down soft skin vehicle, very much similar to the pioneers of the SAS back during their formation. And we would have a machine gun on a rotating turret and a GPMG on a pintle mount on the commander's seat. And we would just operate in the desert for days at a time, completely self-sustaining. Everything we needed to operate and fight with was in the vehicle. And we would patrol the desert, and we would visit various outposts, and we'd sleep in the desert, and we would navigate minefields and meet up with Iraqi police forces at various outposts. And it was a really good experience in being a soldier and operating, I wouldn't say behind enemy lines, because there was only sporadic occasions of violence at that time, but there was a very real threat of IEDs, and we were witnessing this in the north of Iraq with suicide bombers and IEDs targeting police stations and military convoys. Fortunately for us, during that tour, we didn't lose anybody. Nobody was hit. There were occasions where IEDs were detonated. We didn't really sustain any casualties. Some of the other units we were operating with did. So we worked closely with the Danish military. There was the compound where the camp where we were was a hub for NATO forces, really. And I know the Dutch had sustained some casualties, but fortunately for us, it didn't happen for us. There was a couple of occasions where we were fired at, but they weren't aimed shots. They were fired across the border with Iran, and we were strictly told not to engage them unless we were receiving accurate fire, just because of the political complexities that would cause. But I do remember it being quite significant for me as a 19-year-old being shot at, albeit in the general direction, for the first time. And it was the first time I got that feeling in my stomach of being engaged by an enemy. And although it didn't happen for me, it was definitely a very memorable experience. And so that was only a short deployment in Iraq. We operated around the desert, and we trained the Iraqi security forces. And there was a lot of downtime that there often is to deployments. A lot of sitting around the camp, waiting to sort of get a bit of action, if you like. And then that would be broken up with days at a time spent in the desert. So it was a little bit of an anticlimax. I think we were all desperate to do a bit of fighting.
Be careful what you wish for. Be careful for what you wish for. And yeah, you as you know, mate, and as you stated in the book, be careful what you wish for, because you got that and a hell of a lot more.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And during that deployment, I'd met a local girl from the garrison. And as they say, absence makes the heart grow fonder. We'd only been together probably a year and a half. And we said that when I come back from Iraq, I'll tell you what, we'll get married and we'll get a house on the married quarters, because you'd get a big 3-bedroom detached house from the military, and it cost peanuts to live in it. And so I come back from that deployment, and we got married for the wrong reasons. At the time, it felt like the right thing to do. We certainly loved each other, but we were so young, not long to 19, and we didn't really have much time together anyway, because I was always away either on a training exercises or deployments. And so we got married, and we were due to have a child together in 2006. And so in 2006, we start hearing that there might be a deployment coming up to Helmand Province in Afghanistan. And as the blokes in the battalion do, there are rumours that it's lawless, and we're going to potentially get into some proper fighting there. But because the invasion of Iraq was such an anticlimax, and the deployments after that, I don't think any of us truly appreciated what happened or what was going to happen. We just thought it was going to be another disappointing deployment. And things start to escalate on the ground. And it was nearly a year of training beforehand, pretty much all of 2005. After the Iraq deployment, we were preparing for Afghanistan, and we carried out training exercises in Oman, which the terrain there replicated the Afghan mountains and the heat and the desert. We carried out training exercises all around the UK, and we were finally given the green light that it was going to go ahead. And unfortunately, just before the deployment, I'd actually broken my hand, and it was a really stupid alcohol-fueled fight that I got into in the garrison. I broke my hand, and so I thought, it's going to happen again. I'm going to miss the deployment with the battalion, and I'm going to forever be known as a war dodger. But luckily for me, although I deployed a month or so later, I got out there and I got everything that I hoped for and more. But one memorable thing that happened was, before I deployed in the June, my hand was pretty much recovered. I was on the camp, and all of a sudden we were seeing articles in the news and in the newspaper of intense fighting that was happening in Afghanistan, and the stories were coming back of the guys fighting. And at that point, some of the guys that were on an early R&R had rotated back to the UK for their 2 weeks R&R, and we were hearing firsthand of the counterinsurgency operations the battalion were doing. And so that made me even more desperate to get on the ground and do a bit of the fighting that no one had seen this since the end of the Falklands in '82, really, other than the small contingent of paras that went to Sierra Leone. And so I was desperate to get out there. But I do remember the first person that was killed in the battalion, and it was a young soldier called Private Damien Jackson, and he was only 19, barely 19, and he was shot during an ambush, and that was early on in the deployment. And I was given the task of going to his room and packing his belongings away for his mum to come and collect. And that was a really sobering moment, because I was going through his clothes and his pictures and all his personal belongings and deciding what to put into this big box that his mother was going to collect. And it was a really significant time. So I certainly knew what I was going into, but I didn't fully appreciate what ended up happening. I was just so, not gung ho, but just so desperate to get on the ground and do a bit of fighting, which is what you join the military to do. And I deployed in the June, and once you get to Afghanistan, it is mandatory to complete a few days bedding in, where you will acclimatise to some extent. You will zero your weapons for firing. They will go through intelligence briefings, and there's a big emphasis on the rules of engagement. And the rules of engagement changed for that deployment in Northern Ireland. It was very, very strict rules of engagement. So unless your life was in immediate risk, you were not allowed to use your weapon system. Even if someone fired at you, the moment they turn away to run, they're not a legitimate target, because your life isn't immediately in danger. That changed in Afghanistan, and it was more emphasis on a war fighting rules of engagement, where if you had an honestly held belief that your life is in danger, or that they were preparing to launch an attack, the Taliban, we were allowed to engage the enemy. And so I was told that I was going to form part of a machine guns det, a small unit of 6 of us, and we would deploy into an area of Helmand Province called Sangin DC, the Sangin District Centre. The camp at that time, there wasn't many people left on the camp because we were so thin on the ground. And the battalion had landed in Afghanistan, and we deployed to these various outposts in Helmand from Musakala, Gereshk, Nauzad, and Sangin, and we were so thin on the ground, and the battalion had not expected the intensity of the fighting that happened when we got there. So there weren't many people at the camp, but there was a couple of guys coming back to camp before flying back for R&R leave. And so I knew that Sangin was one of the hotspots where some of the most intense fighting had happened. And it was very much a Taliban stronghold. And that was due mainly because of its strategic location in Helmand, next to the Helmand River. The poppy cultivation that went on there, and it was just a Taliban stronghold. So very quickly, I knew that I was going to get everything that I dreamed to do as a para, and there were men in battalion that were coming to the end of their career, and like I say, they'd not fired around in anger, and it was just the way of the world at that time. They were just done back-to-back tours in Northern Ireland. And then all of a sudden, you've got 18-year-old lads that are fighting with the enemy, and it's conventional war fighting. It's not the Taliban had not really cottoned on to the use of IEDs early on in that deployment. There were certainly IEDs in Kabul and in Iraq, but in Helmand it was very much conventional war fighting, which was small arms, automatic weapons, machine guns, RPGs, and mortars. And so we arrived in Sangin, and we relieved a machine guns team that were there, and we were only supposed to be there for a few weeks, but we ended up staying there for 50 days just because there was just not the manpower to relieve us in place. And I think back now, and it was just too long it was too much time of sustained for fighting, because there'd been, I mean, the fighting that the guys did in the Falklands was as extreme as it gets, but it was a few weeks, and this was going to be 50 days.
So, and for you, like, I want to talk about that, Andy, because like your nerves, you're heightened because you're in fighting now, like, and basically you're on edge. Like, I understand, as you say, that 50 days in the, like, in a combat zone, like, and without relief, mate. This is what I want to highlight to people, is that it's not normal. Like, what you're doing is not normal, and no wonder that later on, and we'll talk about the story of how you brought your war home with you. I can understand it, mate. So talk me through. Do you remember your first contact with the enemy, and what was that like when you actually got in contact for the first time?
Yeah. So when we got to Sangin, there was already evidence of the fighting that had happened there. And just before I arrived there, a 107mm rocket had struck the compound wall, and it killed 3 guys. And it was quite a sort of an ominous representation of the fighting that had gone there. And the district centre itself, it was an old government building, and it's just high mud walls, and we'd fortified it with sandbags and Hesco bastion. It wasn't very easy to defend, and it was made well known that the intention of the Taliban was to overrun that compound. And we got there, and I remember seeing the hole in the wall where these 3 guys had been killed. And our main area of responsibility was a flat roof, which was the rooftop, which was infamous with Sangin District Centre. And as a guns unit, we had 50 caliber machine guns strategically placed on the roof, and we would be one of the last lines of defence when they tried to overrun the compound. But additionally to that, we would also put a gun team on the ground patrolling into Sangin with the rifle companies. So it was twofold, really. We'd rotate through the gun positions, but we'd also go onto patrols, which later became known as an advanced contact. They weren't patrols because every time we stepped outside the compound, we'd be ambushed. And so my very first day there, we were involved in a sustained firefight where a good friend of mine was shot through his femur bone. He shattered his femur, he shot through his leg. And another friend of mine was shot through his shoulder. And that was the same day that we arrived. So I very quickly realized I was going to get the combat I'd been so desperate to experience. And I suppose the early memories of being there was very basic living conditions. We slept in a room in that safe house in the district centre. We just slept on the floor. We were on rations. It was very much a hard routine. And we would rotate between 6 of us between the gun positions. We might do an hour and a half on stag duty. And then every day we would get the information from the rifle company that was there. Right, we need a gun team to go out into Sangin in the morning on an operation to flush out Taliban fighters. And so I very quickly got into a routine. There, and every day there was attacks on that compound. And I think with the book, I'm so glad I did this because it helped me enormously. I had an old ration box and I tore a section of cardboard off and I used it as a bit of a diary. And every day I'd put the date, and every time we were attacked, I would document what weapon systems we used, if we had sustained any casualties, if there was any confirmed kills of the Taliban. And as we'll come on to it later, so much of the fighting, my memory suppressed, and I could remember significant moments, but the days almost blurred into one. And it was only when I started putting that down on paper and speaking to some of the guys that I start to remember events. And we saw an intensity in the fighting from when we got there, and quite a few guys had already been killed in Sangin. We lost a couple of guys to a mortar attack, and the complexity and intensity of the fighting started to increase. So what would usually happen is it could be anything from machine gun fire directed towards the Sangers, and then a couple of RPGs, anything to full-scale assaults on the compound with rockets, mortars, followed by like a ground assault on the compound. And we very quickly become quite blasé to being under fire. And I'd always wondered what it would be like to receive accurate incoming fire. But as a young lad, I think I was just so intent at proving myself to the rest of the unit that I was calm under fire. I didn't really think about it too much. It was just very loud, a roller coaster of emotions. I mean, I've heard it described by people since, where you'll have almost like an auditory exclusion, and it's almost like time slows down, and you'll just zero in on certain aspects. That might be the muzzle flash of a firing point, or a certain sound, and time distorts. There were occasions where it felt like we were fighting for hours, and it might only be 20 minutes. But I also remember feeling so exhausted from just an adrenaline dump after an engagement. And we're talking summer. This was summer. This was July in Afghanistan. It was really hot as well, really hot. And then we lived off rations. I started smoking quite heavily, and I just sort of got on with it. I didn't really think much further than the day ahead, and I just took each day as it came. We were given satellite phones to call home, but I personally found my best way of dealing with those conditions was I almost forgot about my life back home. I didn't want to speak to my wife. I just didn't want any vulnerability. But we'd receive packages every now and then. But as the fighting got more intense, they became less and less, to the point where we actually ran out of food for a week or so. And we just lived off the remaining scarce rations that we had, and they were chocolate bars and biscuits. Occasionally the interpreters would be able to source us some what's called a hummus, and it's an Arabic, an Afghan flatbread. We came very low to running out of ammunition, and on one occasion we received a bad batch of 50 caliber ammunition. And during an engagement, every second round there would be a stoppage on the gun, which is fatal during an engagement. And fortunately, they replaced it with a batch of Estonian ammunition. And yeah, that was us, mate. Every day we just rotated through, and we would go out on these various advances to contact with the rifle companies.
So at that point too, where you say you didn't really ring home, your wife's pregnant at this point too, isn't she?
Yeah.
So that's what I mean, mate. Like that's like you're just mission focused, like that, and as you say, you had to do that to survive. Like you had to desensitize yourself from home life to just be mission focused. And a lot of veterans I've spoken to, mate, same thing, just would say wouldn't call home. We're just laser focused on the mission, and like that's just crazy. Like no food, almost running out of ammunition. Like that's just like a crazy time of your life. And as you said, be careful for what you wish for, mate, because you got everything you wish for and more. And in the book, you talk about the longest day. Talk me through that chapter and the period after that. You're still at Sangin at this point, aren't you? You're still in the DZ. This is the longest day.
Yes. So that particular patrol, it was a deliberate operation to target some high value Taliban fighters that we knew in the area, and they flew in a company fresh. They flew in B Company fresh from Camp Bastion, and I remember seeing the guys get off the helicopter, and they were clean shaven. The gear was nice and clean, and they had clean water in the water bottles and food, and fresh faced. They'd experienced some intense fighting elsewhere, but they flew in deliberately for this operation. But we were going to put a gun team out on the ground with them, and it was my turn for this operation. And at this point, we were completely emaciated. I'd lost so much weight, and I had a large, fiery ginger beard, and I just, I didn't look too dissimilar to some of the Taliban fighters we'd been fighting. And at this point in our stay at Sangin, we had become very used to the firefights. And so we deployed out on the ground, and it was a first light deployment into Sangin. And Sangin is unique in that where the government building is, where we were staying, before you get to the main buildings, there is a dead zone, a bit of there's nothing there. There's just open ground for 100, 150 meters or so. So it made it was good from a defensibility perspective, because it was more difficult for the Taliban to get closer to actually assault that compound. Although there were occasions where we were literally throwing grenades over the wall. But it was a disadvantage when we went out on patrol, because as soon as we left those compound walls, we would be engaged by the enemy, and we were essentially sitting ducks until we got into the hard cover of the buildings in Sangin. And so we went out on this first light patrol. Not long after leaving the compound, we are ambushed by the Taliban, and it is a sustained engagement with the enemy for the whole of that day. 6, 7, 8 hours of engagement of varying levels of intensity. So occasionally it was just a rapid burst of fire, and we don't have no idea where it's coming from, and we're just making our way towards the hard cover. And it is a miracle how no one got shot early on. And we always knew when we were going to be ambushed, because the Sangin town would be like a ghost town, and the population would just disappear. And we got into the main buildings of the town, and again, they're just dried mud compound buildings with high walls and various compartments. And when we got into the thick of these compounds, it's almost like a maze to navigate. And the compounds were surrounded by cornfields. And that proved to be a big disadvantage for us, because we were in the compounds where we didn't really know the intricacies of navigating these compounds. And the Taliban were in there with us. And there were occasions where we could hear them, and they would pop out into the alleyways. They might fire an RPG in our direction, and then they would disappear again. And it gradually got more intense, and there were rounds ricocheting down the alleyway. And there was a couple of occasions where rounds would hit in the dry mud wall just feet from my head, and it was just a miracle how nobody got shot. And there were just occasions where we would return fire, and then there would be a lull in the battle, and we would continue navigating our way through the compound. And it is extremely hot, and we are exhausted, and we're carrying so much equipment, so much ammunition, especially for the machine gun. And then there comes a point where we track the Taliban to a singular compound, and we're constantly pushing them north towards the Helmand River. So the Taliban at this point, they're literally fighting with everything they've got. They're fighting for their lives. And we are told that we will wait for a 500-pound bomb from the air support to hit the compound, and we will then rush forward through an open ground, and we will assault the compound and kill any enemy fighters. And there's remnants of the fighting that had gone on. There are firing positions where there's brass casing in a pile, and I remember looking next to a tree, and there was a pool of blood and drag marks where someone had been hit. And there's a distinctive point where we're waiting at the start line, if you like, in an alleyway, and there's a section of open ground, and then the compound itself, and we're waiting for that bomb to drop, and then we would rush forward and assault the compound. And we get bombs away, and the 500-pound hits the compound, and I get up from my knees to rush forward. And for a reason I will never know, one of the platoon sergeants, as I get up to run forward, he grabs me by the back of my collar and he yanks me back. And at that same moment, a burst of machine gun fire peppers the floor and the mud wall where we were about to run out to. And they must have known where we were going to exit from and just had their weapons zeroed in on that point. And I fall to the ground. I sort of dust myself off. And then we get up and we rush forward and we cross an area of open ground, probably 60 to 80 meters, and take cover behind a wall. And so we know the Taliban are in this compound and they've got nowhere else to go. And so we start navigating the compound, clearing the rooms. But because of the intensity of the fighting at this point, the platoon is split, and there's a section of the platoon in one area and we're in another area. And there's part of the platoon are with the platoon commander or with the platoon sergeant and his element. And as everything in war is carnage and it is disorganized and it is loud, and we're just trying to do the best that we can. And there's a very distinctive moment where we can hear the Taliban fighters a few yards away, but they're behind mud walls. And Stu suggests that we throw hand grenades over the walls and try and target the Taliban fighters. But because we're split and we don't know where everybody is exactly in the compound, we can't risk hitting one of our own with the grenades. So we take cover, and there's a moment where I look to an irrigation ditch and I see one of our Taliban interpreters curled up in the irrigation ditch, but he's completely motionless. So I think that he's been shot. I think that he's dead. And it takes me a while looking at him. And I nudge Stu. And then I remember just seeing a tear stream down his face. And when I look on closer inspection, I can see that he's pissed his pants in fear. And that was the level of the intensity of the fighting. And he was just taking cover in a ditch. And then we're given the command to fix bayonets to our weapons. So as a gun team, we'll have the machine gun on and a tripod. But then the number 2 on the gun, their role is of a spotter and to feed the belt-fed ammunition into the gun. But they'll also have a rifle. And on this occasion, I was the spotter. So we're told to fix bayonets. And it was a very surreal experience because there's a whole period of bayonet training in Para Depot, but I couldn't remember the last time that Paras were told to fix bayonets during battle. And I remember this very surreal moment thinking, Jesus Christ, there's a very good chance of me having to use this. And I was absolutely ready to. There would have been no hesitation. It was just a surreal moment, the audible click of the bayonet on the end of your rifle. And then we are to carry on assaulting the compound. And at this point, just behind us, the platoon sergeant and one of the junior paras, they make their way up onto a flat roof, and they're trying to get eyes on a cornfield because we're still receiving enemy fire coming from that direction. So we're trying to spot a firing point so we can launch an attack and come up with a bit of a plan tactically. And then we hear on the radio that there's a burst of fire, and then we hear that somebody's been shot and there's the cry for a medic. And as Stu and I are the closest to the where it happened, we pick up our gear and we make our way down the alleyway to a mud wall, and there is a makeshift ladder. So we climb up the ladder, and at this time there's still incoming fire coming in, and I climb onto the flat roof, and a friend of mine is lying there motionless, called Paddy, and he was at my wedding just not too long in the months previous, and he was lying there motionless, and I thought he was dead, but I couldn't see any blood. And there's the junior para that's on that roof with him. He's taking cover behind a half wall, and he gives us a bit of a situation update. And a single round had come in from the area of the cornfield, and it shot Paddy through the neck. So it's complete carnage at this point, and I'm trying to assess Paddy, but everything is in slow motion, and I can't see any blood, and I have no peripheral vision. I'm just completely tunnel focused in, and he's not showing me any signs of life, and he's so pale. I think he's dead, and then I think I can see what the entry point at the base of his neck, and so I tell Stu. Stu was a lance corporal, so he was senior to me, and he really took command of that small rooftop, and he organised everything, and he said very clearly, "This is the plan. We're going to lay down suppressing fire. We're going to get Paddy off this roof, and he's going to be CASEVAC'd, and then we're going to assault that enemy position." And that's what we did. We had the dilemma of he was shot through the neck, but we had to get him off that roof. And so between a few of us, we navigate the flat roof and get him down into the alleyway. And I remember feeling how heavy a limp body is with the kit and equipment. And, you know, we're struggling and we're doing the best that we can. And we withdraw to where next to the irrigation ditch. I carry out a very rapid assessment of him, and we're pulling his body armor off him, and I'm trying to find the exact entry point so we can plug it. And we're told to leave him in situ, and we all go back and we'll go back to that roof and engage the enemy to aid his evacuation. And this is the how carnage it was at that point. So a medic is dispatched from the compound on a quad bike with a stretcher on top of a trailer, and you know, absolutely by himself, he's riding this trailer through the center of Sangin, and there's rounds popping off everywhere. And at one point, the quad bike is hit by an RPG, and the RPG hits the quad bike. The quad rolls, but for some miraculous reason, the RPG doesn't detonate. So gets back onto the quad, continues pushing his way deep into the compound, and they put Paddy on the stretcher and they evacuate him. And at this point, we carry on fighting. We end up withdrawing to a building that we referred to as the Chinese restaurant, and it was an old building, and the architecture of that building was very oriental, and we just nicknamed it the Chinese restaurant. We took cover in there, and we had all of Paddy's day sack, his weapon, his belongings, and we put it in a room. And I'm just overcome by complete exhaustion at this point. And there's a moment where there's guys in sentry positions, and there's firing going off, but at this point we're not being used. And we take cover in this old Afghan room, and Stu and I make a brew, we make a cup of tea, and I sort of drift off into unconsciousness for a moment, and then what must have only been a few minutes, and then I'm woken up again by the sound of explosions and gunfire, and we eventually make our way back to the safety of the government building, and not long after that, B Company fly back to Camp Bastion, and we continue with our routine. And I'm not too long after that, I'm on sentry position again, looking out, and I'm just like, what has happened? And one of the things that later came back to haunt me was I only had one shirt with me because, like I said, we was only supposed to be there for a few weeks, and the cuff and the sleeves of the shirt was saturated in Paddy's blood. And I looked at my hands, and there was dried blood all on my hands and my fingers and underneath my fingernails. And even to this day, mate, if I have a particularly bad day and I'm gnawing at my fingernails, and if there's blood, it takes me right back. It's not a flashback, but I'm just overwhelmed with those emotions. But and because of the conditions, it was only a few days later I was actually able to get down to the river and try and scrub my shirt clean. And of course I couldn't get the blood out. And it was only a small thing, but it just stuck with me. And I always questioned whether we could have done anything differently that day, if we could have been faster, more effective. I really don't think we could have, because of just the intensity of the fighting. But fortunately, Paddy survived, but he is paralyzed from his neck down, and he has been ever since that day. I never spoke to him about the day. I don't think he would ever remember what happened from our role in that. But I did reach out to him before the book, and I asked his permission to put down what happened, and he was more than supportive. But yeah, that was just one of many days that that stuck with me years after.
It's wild, mate. Like, I'm just sitting here, just as we said, and as you said, be careful for what you wish for, because as you say, you're young, you're keen, you want to get into it, and then literally, mate, you're fighting for your life. Like, you are, and such intense like fighting, and like, so that happens. And then, do you have any other, well, obviously you did, but you had other significant contacts? And then how long is that deployment in Afghanistan?
So the main battalion were there nearly 7 months. My deployment was about 5.5 months because I missed that first month or so. We returned from Sangin after 50 days. Some of the fighting there was so intense. There were times, Adam, where I just felt like I was having a breakdown. It was so intense, the fighting, and I was pulling chunks out of my hair. It just that was the effect it was having on us. And we returned from there. We had one day back at the camp to have a shave and a shower for the first time, and then we redeployed the very next day to a place called Kajaki. And Kajaki was synonymous with being one of the most heavily mined areas of the world. I only spent a few weeks in Kajaki, and we were on top of a high feature, and we would provide an overwatch to the valley below. And we were mortared, and there were the occasional rocket attack, but it was nowhere near the intensity of those 50 days. And shortly after that, in the October, we returned back to the UK. The deployment came to an end. We actually handed over to the Royal Marines in Kajaki, and I always find it quite amusing because at that point in the tour, the guys had seen and done so much. There was numerous gallantry awards given out. I was involved in an operation where Brian Budd won a Victoria Cross, and at that point in the deployment, we had so much experience, and there was an old saying that when it comes to the slaughter, bombs, bullets, and water, and all that really related to was in warfighting, you just need the very minimal amount of kit, the basics for fighting. And we were, there were occasions where we were fighting in shorts and flip flops and a plate carrier, and I just had an old Claymore bag full of ammunition and grenades and water, and that was it. And we were all long hair and we were all skinny. And the Royal Marines turned up, and they again an extremely elite unit, part of the British Armed Forces. Their first time on the ground, we must have looked like probably resembled more of a militia unit than the British Army at this point. And they had all their issued gear and sun cream and ear defenders. And at that point in the tour, we didn't bother. It probably why my hearing is terrible now. So, and we handed over to them, and they would be there for the winter. We rotated back to the UK, but there was a very sorry, Adam.
Yeah, no, sorry, mate. You go. You go. I was just going to ask you. I was going to bring back into the part where you come back to the UK, and we'll get into that. But continue, mate. Continue.
Yeah, I was just going to say we left Helmand Province. We had a night in Kabul, and then the British Army would carry out a 24-hour decompression period in Cyprus. And this was such a bizarre experience. And it was so poorly managed because we flew into Cyprus. They basically didn't want us to mix with any civilian population for a period because, we were really up, we were up there. We were sort of adrenaline fueled. And they didn't want us going back to the garrison town and causing anarchy in the town. So we had a period of decompression. And I remember we sat in a tent, and we were in a beach cove in Cyprus, miles away from anybody. And there was a very token effort speech by an army doctor, and he just said, he asked everybody to put their hand up if they thought they'd taken somebody's life. And so hands went up. And then he said, when you go back to Colchester, where we were based, if any of you start to struggle with some of the experiences, signpost us to go down the route of the med centre. From start to finish, it was probably 20 minutes, and a company strength in the tent. Nobody was listening. Everybody was just thinking about having a beer, and that was it. And I, at that time, my dad had retired to Cyprus, and he actually lived about 30, 40 minutes away from where we were, and I'd not seen him in years. And he'd recently recovered from a prostate cancer. So I spoke to a sergeant major, and I said, look, I've not seen my dad in years. This is the situation. Is there any chance I could just go and see him for the night before we rotate back to the UK? And to my surprise, he agreed. And they had an RAF driver drive me to my dad's villa. and I left the company, and it probably wasn't the best idea, but it was a very surreal moment because I was dropped off in his villa was in Pathos, and I had all these childhood memories of holidays in Pathos, and these are the same. This is the same area where, like I say, I had all these childhood memories, and I distinctly remember being there as a child, thinking, I want to be a soldier, and I had all these aspirations of being a paratrooper, and then almost fast forward a few years, I'm back there, I'm standing on the same ground. I've just had all of these experiences, and it was just such a surreal moment. It was almost like a video playing. It just didn't feel real. And I didn't tell my dad I was going to visit him, and he barely recognized me when he opened the door because I had this sounds a little bit perverse, but I was wearing some Gulf World War One American DPM shorts, and I'd taken these shorts off a dead Taliban fighter because I saw them in when we recovered the bodies. We had a store that had clothing in there, and I saw these trousers, and I thought there's a term in the British paras, and if something is quite cool or gnarly or doggish, we'd say it's alley. So I thought pretty alley, those shorts. So I made them into shorts. So I had these cut off at the knee desert shorts, a ripped machine guns t-shirt, a big beard. I was smoking heavily and long hair, and I just looked like a tramp. Still sort of rugged and dirty. And he opened the door and he said, he sort of said, "Look at the state of you, lad." And I don't really remember much that evening. I just remember almost just being completely zoned out to everything. And we had a few beers and we chatted. And then the next morning, early morning, I rotated back. And I mean, the guys caused carnage on that beach. There were guys in hospital. There were guys still asleep on the beach. It was just tension that had built up, and just complete anarchy. And so we rotated back to the UK, and then I had a period of annual leave, and then not long after that is where I started to, although I didn't know it at the time, my wife knew straight away that I wasn't right. I wasn't the same person that left.
This next, sorry, mate. This next part
yeah.
is where I loved in the book where you talked about you brought the war home with you, and this was where you really, and I'm gonna plug it, Andy, because you got so raw here, and so like the vulnerability really showed through in this part of your writing. And like for you, was that probably the hardest part of the book in looking back now? Like, was that the hardest part? And for you, this is where you actually really had to face up to a lot of demons, and the demons almost won. So can you talk me through this part of the next part of your life?
Yeah, absolutely. Writing this chapter or a couple of chapters, it was without doubt the worst part. And going over some of the contacts and some of the engagements that I was involved with were difficult. But writing about this next part so many years later, I'd also almost put that to bed. And when I think back at that time, it's like I'm thinking of somebody else. It's not like I'm thinking of me. And it was a completely normal reaction to an extreme set of circumstances. And I always wondered why that it affected me so intently and not other people. And I later learned that there's other contributing factors. It's well documented that childhood trauma contributes a lot. I know that a lot more lads were affected than I ever knew, and that only became apparent after I released the book and blokes contacted me. Because as a para, you are a fit, aggressive, and you're not meant to show emotion. You're certainly not meant to. It was certainly seen as a sign of weakness, and it's completely wrong. And when I got back, I couldn't integrate back into normal life, and I was during that first part of annual leave, I was obsessively thinking about Afghanistan, and I'd had a couple of flashbacks at this point, and it would usually be it was always a certain pitch and a certain sound, and it would just take me right back there. I was so hyper vigilant. It was almost as if the amygdala, the part of my brain that registered danger, it couldn't regulate itself. So if someone slammed a door or dropped a plate, it would take me right back there. But I was just emotionless. I just felt robotic, like just completely no feeling. And I didn't feel happy about being home. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel sadness. I just was walking around in just like a dream-like state. And then what happened that definitely didn't help is I started to have a series of medical problems. So I'd convinced myself on that rooftop that was where I was destined to be killed, because there was just too many times where I should have died and I didn't. And I also come at peace with it that was where I was going to be killed. And this was just my immature mind trying to make sense of this carnage. And so I got back and I was so deflated and just disconnected from everything. And then not long after that, I went to a doctor and he diagnosed me with skin cancer. And it was the most aggressive form of skin cancer, malignant melanoma. And it was in my neck. And he said he doesn't know how far that the cancer spread, but it's very serious and it needs to be operated on immediately. I only went to the doctor to appease my wife at the time, because she was mithering me about a freckle that she'd noticed. And I only went to the doctor really to get her off my back, really. And so I was told that I had cancer, and I was still battling with all these memories of Afghanistan. She had just given birth to our son, so I had all the emotions that come with being a father. And I stopped going to bed. I stopped sleeping. And this all compounded everything, because if I slept, I would have horrendous nightmares. And I didn't want to be awake because I just couldn't stop. I couldn't stop my mind from thinking. And so I just drank. So yeah, I just drank alcohol to just have that feeling of being of numbness. So I was being investigated for the cancer, and then I started pissing blood. So I thought the cancer had spread to my organs, and I thought, well, this was my destiny, to die of cancer. I should have died out there on the battleground, but well, this is why this is happening to me. And I thought of it as a punishment. So I'm this point I'm being investigated for the cancer, and I think it's spread. And and this is all it's all building up. So I am not sleeping, I'm drinking excessively, and then in a warped way, I developed this really strange coping mechanism, and I desperately wanted to feel something emotionally because I felt like I was dead inside. And so I started ordering videos off the internet of people being executed in all kinds of horrific ways. And the reason for that was I just wanted to feel something because I didn't feel sad or angry or anything. And so I would obsessively during the night when my wife was in bed, would watch these videos in the dark, and I would focus on every detail to try and feel something, and just whilst I was drinking, but it never came. You know, I was watching these videos of people being executed. I didn't feel anything, no remorse, no empathy. Just it was like my emotions were broke, and so this all continued, and then it got to a significant point that was really the catalyst for me getting help. And that was one evening. We had some friends over on a weekend, and we were just having drinks in the kitchen and chatting. And it was fine. We were having a good time. I was still completely. I wasn't in the room, if that makes sense. Physically, I was in the room, but I wasn't there. And the conversations were just noise to me. And we'd all had a few to drink. And my sister-in-law at the time, as the night goes on, we start play fighting with each other in the kitchen. And we're just messing around, and we're listening to music, and we're laughing and joking. And we start sparring. Well, we're not sparring. I'm holding up a boxer's pose, and she is throwing jabs at me and punches, and I'm sort of ducking and weaving, and it's all light-hearted. And then she throws one punch, and it connects with me on the side of the head, and it is the feeling of bone on bone, and it stings. And in that moment, it is the first thing that I felt in months, and that is the feeling of pain. And for some reason, like a light switch, I just had this surge of emotions that come up, and I just started with two clenched fists. I just started hitting myself in the face as hard as I could, harder and harder. And, you know, they were just watching me. And I had cut my lip, and I had bloodied my nose. And I was just crying, uncontrollably crying. I mean, it must have been something like a horror film for them to watch. And it was just like all months of emotion had come up. And then my brother-in-law, who's in the kitchen, he jumps up from the dining room table, and he throws his arms around me like a bear hug to stop myself from punching myself. And we're not wrestling, but we fall, and we fall against the kitchen worktop. And in that moment, I look to my left, and I can see the wooden knife block. I can see the large black handle of the kitchen knife. And in that moment, upset and drunk and full of rage and hurting, I pull the knife out of the knife block, and I just start cutting at my wrists in front of everybody. And he lets go of me, and they're absolutely petrified. And this is only directed at myself, and I'm crying uncontrollably. And Eventually, I let go of the knife and I'm just sobbing. And my wife probably should have called the police, but she actually called the battalion, and one of my friends came out, and they managed to stop the bleeding. He sat with me all night. So that was really the catalyst for me getting help. And they said, "We'll get you the help that you need." But I just thought, you can't help me. And I remember days later, my wife said to me, she said she felt like she was gonna die that night, although it was only directed at me. And I was so emotionless at that time. I replied to her with a really unsensitive comment, and I just said, well, welcome to my world, the feeling of thinking like you're going to die. And she moved out of the house, and she helped me get support from the army. And I saw a psychologist in the army, and it was really good, actually. That was really where the foundation of the book came from, because I said to him, so many things happened. I can't remember all of the engagements and all of the things that happened, and all the decisions that I made, whether that was to squeeze the trigger or not squeeze the trigger, experiences of Paddy, and more so than anything was just that overwhelming feeling of, I feel like I'm going to die in this moment, right now, and I'd come to terms with that. And so it was decided that the best course of action was for me to leave the military, and they were still helping me out from a medical perspective. And so I had nearly a year of medical appointments and seeing the psychologist regularly. And I was medicated as well to help me sleep and just to help me be a little bit calmer. And going back to the cancer, I had a couple of surgeries, and they removed a section of the area. Fortunately, I didn't have to have chemotherapy, but it put me at an extremely high risk category of developing cancer in the future, because I'd spent so much time in Saudi, and I'm very fair, and so I'd have repeat appointments. And then at the same time, I was seeing a renal specialist at a hospital in Cambridge. And then so I ended up being medically discharged out of the military. And at the same time, I got a diagnosis for me pissing blood, and it was an incurable kidney disease. And they just said to me that there is no known cause for the disease, but it is incurable, and eventually you will have complete renal failure. So there was so much going on in my life at that time. My wife and I had split. I had been diagnosed from the military. I'd been discharged from the military. The therapies with the session with the psychologist had helped massively, and I didn't want this to define me. I didn't want this to define my life, because there were moments where, when I was at my worst, I really didn't know whether I wanted to carry on living at all. And I'd thought about ways of taking my own life. That night I cut my wrists. I think it was more of a cry for help, but in that moment I was certainly intent on doing some serious harm to myself in that moment. And fast track, so this was end of 2007, and I was discharged from the military at the end of 2008, beginning of 2009. And I'd come a long way. And I think that, like I said, I didn't want what happened to define me. And so I applied the same determination and resilience that I had done all those years ago. And I decided that whatever I was going to do, I was going to be the best at it. And I applied to the prison service in the UK. I applied to the police force in London, and I applied to the security services, MI5, which deals with domestic counterintelligence in the UK. And I come to a point with my kidney diagnosis where they said there's no known cure. However, people live with this condition for years. You might never need you will need a transplant, but it could be 30 years down the line. But equally, it could be a few months. So the treatment plan was to just manage the deterioration of my kidney function, manage my blood pressure, which was through the roof because of my kidneys not doing their job effectively of cleansing the blood of toxins. And at the same time, I was trying to figure out what I was going to do for the rest of my life. And so I applied for those organizations. And then as part of a resettlement course for the military, I did a 3-month close protection course to become a bodyguard. And the course was one of the most reputable courses in the country at that point. And it was delivered by former Special Forces guys over in Hereford. And it covered every facet of close protection / bodyguarding, from looking after a principal, surveillance, all manner of close protection operations. And that really did help me in the future. And I suppose coming from the Parachute Regiment, the natural progression is to go into that line of work because it's what I'd always done to an extent. Not the softer skills side of things, but close protection to an extent, and work in hostile environments. And my PTSD, I received a diagnosis of complex PTSD, and it was manageable. I'd come off my medication. I had a new focus in life. I'd drawn a line in the sand under my experiences in the military, and I still had bouts of bad days, but they were manageable, and I knew my triggers, and it was okay. It was just the kidney side of things. So I initially was accepted into the prison service, and I very nearly started a job in Wormwood Scrubs, which is a prison in London. And I was just waiting for the medical, and then I was going to be given a start date. And at the same time, I had my application back from the security services, and they said, you were successful, you'll move on to the next phase of selection, which was more written tests, logic, reasoning, cognitive assessments. Because I thought never in a million years would I be accepted into the service, because I didn't have any formal qualifications. But I was so determined and, again, obsessive about doing the best that I could. And then so fast track, the recruitment process was well over a year, and the vetting formed a big portion of that. And I was accepted into a role in the service, where I spent the next few years. And I moved to London, and I lived and worked in the capital. And it was really good to begin with. I had a career if I wanted it. I had been completely open and honest about my medical history. And at this time, in 2011, the US had withdrawn from the Middle East, from Iraq. And so there was a huge vacuum in the Middle East, and we started to see the emergence of various insurgents groups in Iraq, all fighting for all sectarian violence between different religious groups, and there was also the emergence of the Islamic State. And so I made a decision, and it was probably one of the biggest decisions I have made in my life. I decided to leave the career that I had in the service, and the role that I was involved with was not the end game. I was always interested in body language and behavioural science and why people do what they do. And a lot of that came from my childhood. I was really interested in developmental psychology, and I'd started studying a couple of courses. But the department where I wanted to move into, I didn't have the academic qualifications. And so I made the decision to leave and go and do close protection. And so many friends I'd served with were out in Iraq. They were earning a ridiculous amount of money on armoured convoys. And nobody knew that I worked for the security service other than my sister and my brother, but they didn't know to a full extent what I was doing. So I told them I was going to leave the Crown Service, and they thought I was crazy after what it took to actually get to be offered a job there. I said, look, I'd rather take a risk and fall flat on my face than live in regret that I'd not put myself out there. And probably naively, as a young 23-year-old, I always thought I'd be okay in finding work. I didn't realise how tough the civilian world could be. And so my first job in close protection, if you like, was actually in London. And I was a direct bodyguard for a billionaire Russian family. And I worked directly for the family in London, and there's only a small team of us, and we would escort them to various meetings. We would maintain the properties that they had. We would travel to other parts of the world with them and take care of the family. But it wasn't the idea I had in my mind of doing close protection. And anybody will tell you that it's certainly not all glamorous. There's a lot of waiting around. There's a lot of affection and carrying, and it's not all fancy restaurants and 5-star hotels. And because of the political climate in the Middle East at this time, and what was to be the start of the Arab Spring, I was desperate to get out to the Middle East. And so after I only spent not even a year on that contract with the family, I applied with a company to go out to Iraq and work on the armed protection convoys. And the company I applied for was probably one of the most reputable companies operating in country at that time. And they had their own internal selection process. So again, I had to go away and do another selection course. And so many people were leaving the military. The security companies could really pick the guys that they had the pick of the best guys that they wanted to deploy in these contracts. And that was why they had a selection course. I was fortunate enough to be offered a job as the role was a medic / shooter, although you're essentially just like a second in command on the convoys. So there would be a team leader, myself as the second in command. There would be an Iraqi interpreter, and then all of the drivers were local nationals, local Iraqis. And I deployed back to Iraq at the end of 2011. And the contract I was involved with was looking after American clients, mostly from the oil and gas industry. And we would be given our task in each day. we would plan our route and our actions on, and we would drive these dangerous roads to government buildings, the Ministry of Interior, and various meetings. And that was what I did for a number of years. And the role involved 3 months in country, just living on a camp, and then I'd have a month off, which was really good. I was in a position where I was earning more money than I'd ever experienced, and I had experienced extreme poverty, as a kid, and just not having money at all. So I was 23, 24 years old, and I had more money than I ever experienced, and I was traveling the world. And yeah, there was certainly a threat there, but it was mostly through roadside IEDs, suicide bombers. There was still fighting going on in certain areas, but fortunately, I was never involved in any of that in terms of close quarter sort of fighting, attacks on the convoy. And so I did that for nearly 4 years, and I was single at the time, and I'd spend as much time as I could with my son, and we always had a really good relationship. But I didn't know anything other than being a soldier. I didn't have any qualifications, and I suppose there's a lot of similarities to my dad, because it was my only chance of earning half decent money, giving my son everything that he needed, and I enjoyed the work. It was a continuation of being a soldier, because you worked in. Everyone there were veterans, and we were responsible for training the local nationals, and we would carry out vehicle drills and contact drills, weapon handling, and then every day we were deployed to various parts of Iraq on different missions with different objectives. And so fast forward to 2014, the end of 2014, I met my wife. I shouldn't say my current wife. So I met her for the first time whilst I was on annual leave, and I suppose we just connected. I never had any intention of having a long-term girlfriend ever again. I was just too much of a complicated person to open up to, really, to live with. So it took me by surprise. And her upbringing and her childhood was the polar opposite to mine. And it took a lot of getting used to, because she has a huge family. They're all so close. They ring each other numerous times a day. She was brought up in a loving home with, relatively middle class. But she was just a really good person, and she didn't judge me. And in those early days, she didn't really know the full extent of my history, although I'd mentioned some parts. But then I didn't want to spend all that time away from home, and a short amount of time with her and my son in the UK. And then I started having these feelings of, well, is history not just repeating itself? Am I not just doing what my dad did? Although I always had a good relationship with my son's mother, she put up with more than any woman should when I was at my worst with drinking and going through that really bad period. But we split amicably, and we had a good relationship. And I always had a good relationship with my son. And at that point, I just thought, I'm going to return to the UK, and I'm going to have a crack at the UK circuit, so to speak, of bodyguarding and close protection. And So yeah, I moved back to the UK. We bought a house for us with the money that I was making in Iraq, near where she lived, because she was so close to her family. We ended up moving to the northwest of the UK, and I had very different pieces of work from. They always say in the close protection world that you can't be a job snob. So some taskings are really boring and not enjoyable. It might mean sitting in a car outside somebody's house for 12 hours at a time. But what happens is, as long as you do your job with professionalism and you do a good job, you are given an opportunity to network. And what would happen is jobs would lead to other jobs and you'd network with more people. And it's such a close knit industry. And your reputation is everything, really. And slowly I got onto more better jobs. And I started doing surveillance work in the UK and across Europe, various surveillance taskings from corporate espionage to matrimonial cases, all on the private circuit. And I had my own surveillance van, and it was just another sort of string to my bow. And then I was given an opportunity to train civilians that wanted to go out to areas of conflict or hostile environments. And the courses are called Hostile Environment Awareness Training. And I started running these courses where they were a couple of weeks at a time. To begin with, they were in the UK, and we would train with our clients. They varied from government agencies to NGOs, charity workers, journalists, and then we started to run these courses abroad as well. So after the fall of I shouldn't say the fall, but the uprising against President Bashar al-Assad in Syria and the Syrian war, we started to deploy to Syria early on in the conflict, to a border region. And the organization I was working for, we worked closely with Syrian journalists that were living through this war, and we would just give them a level of training to help keep them safe, really. And we would facilitate crisis management type training, and just an awareness of keeping yourself safe in a hostile environment. And it was a fantastic job because I got to travel. I was away from home, but it would only be for a few weeks at a time, and then I'd be back in the UK. And because I was freelancing, I was always chasing work. I had the opportunity to be involved with a couple of undercover operations, one being 4 months completely undercover, that really put a strain on my relationship with my wife. And it was over in Asia, and I decided at that point that I wasn't going to do that anymore. I'd continue on with the training. And then occasionally the client started to ask me and some of the other senior consultants to deploy on the ground with them. And it was mostly media crews. And one of the last deployments I did was at the end of 2016. And 2 years earlier, ISIS had taken Mosul from the Iraqi security forces, and they pretty much walked through Mosul unchallenged with little fighting, and they declared Mosul and into Syria, part of his Islamic Caliphate, and they were there for 2 years. 2016, the Iraqi security forces, mostly the Golden Division, which is their special forces, and Kurdish Peshmerga fighters, decided that they were going to launch an operation to reclaim Mosul back from ISIS. I was given the opportunity to deploy on the ground with an American news team. And the idea is that we would be on the ground and we would deliver a piece to the camera as it was happening in real time to the world. And it was a fantastic experience because we were a couple of bounds. We were just behind the Peshmerga fighters who were doing the initial fighting. So they would go in and clear a village, and they would either take a number of ISIS fighters hostage, or they would kill them, and we would push the Taliban into the city. And then the next day, we would move further and further up into Mosul, and we would document all the villages that had been destroyed. We had the opportunity to go into some of the tunnels that ISIS were using for fighting, and it was an amazing experience to see their clothing and their bedding and their pots and pans. They were still there from just hours earlier where they'd been fighting. What ISIS had done at that time, a lot of the fighters had shaven their beards, and the reason for that was to try and blend in with the local population. So I was deployed on the ground for about 3 weeks, and I would constantly feed intelligence reports back to the organisation I was working for on an update on the ground. And I returned from that in early 2017. My health just took an absolute U-turn, and over the period of a few weeks, my kidney function just plummeted. And up to that point, I had regular appointments at the hospital, at the renal clinic, and they would assess my full blood works. They would monitor my kidney deterioration, but it still allowed me to deploy in operations. But that all changed at the beginning of 2017, and I went into complete renal failure. And so, not for the first time in my life, I once again was coming to terms with my own mortality. And the day that I was rushed into hospital, because my kidneys stopped working completely and my body had just poisoned itself, I actually soiled myself. And the doctor told me that this thing it happens in the animal kingdom, where if an old animal is about to die, they will purge itself of bodily fluid. And that was what had happened to me. I was rushed into intensive care and immediately put into an induced coma. They couldn't believe that I was still alive because of the levels of toxins in my blood from creatine, which is a byproduct of a muscle breakdown, but it's highly toxic. Potassium, which is lethal in high levels, and it affects the algorithm of your heart. And they inserted a tube into my neck, into the main artery in my neck, and I was on. I was only in an induced coma for a few days, and then I was placed on life-saving hemodialysis. And after a few weeks, they released me from the intensive care unit, and I relied on the dialysis to stay alive. And every other day, I would go to the hospital, plug myself into the machine, and I was on the transplant list. And so my life just turned on its head. And I'd never, I'd had injuries in the past, but I was always so stubborn and determined. I'd never experienced a feeling like it, and that was my body shutting down, and there was nothing I could do about it. So that was something I had to come to terms with, and I didn't really know what the future was going to hold. And in a weird turn of events, all these years later, my sister stepped up again, and she donated me a kidney. And so all those years ago, she sacrificed her childhood to raise me as her own. And then all these years later, in on the 6th of June, so coincidentally the same day as the D-Day landings, 6th of June 2017, she donated a kidney to me and saved my life.
A saint, mate. She's a saint.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not a conversation you ever think you're going to have with anybody. And I was never going to ask anybody in the family for a kidney, and she had 2 kids of her own. But she was determined that was what she wanted to do, and I didn't have a choice in the matter. And we had the surgery, and there was a distinct moment where I was lying on the surgical table. I was in the hospital bed, and I was about to go into surgery to have the transplant. And I made a promise to myself that if I survived the transplant and I woke up, I was going to publish a book, and I was going to use the stuff I'd written down back at the end of 2006 and some of the other notes that I had, and whether it would be any good or not, I wanted to give that book to my son to just tell him all the things all the things that had happened that he wasn't aware of, and also friends and family that I'd not really spoken to about some of the experiences that I had. And fortunately, the transplant was a success. I was out of the hospital within a week and into recovery. And almost just over a year to the day, I joined the fire service at the end of 2018.
And talk me through that, mate. Talk me through, like, Louise had, she was instrumental in this, like, the journey as well. And she sort of suggested that you joined the UK Fire Service, didn't she?
Yeah, yes. So we were living together, and she was actually working for the fire service at that time. Only recently, but she had a background as an admin in administration, and she was working for the fire service. And she kept saying to me, because I didn't know what I was going to do at that point, I ruled out the idea of trying to get back on the circuit. I was now immunocompromised, and I would have to have medication. I do have to have medication for the rest of my life so that my body doesn't reject my kidney. And she suggested the fire service. And I'd always admired the fire service, and it was always something that interested me. But I always had this perception that it was so difficult to get in. I never really given it much thought. And Louise had said to me, there are so many veterans in the fire service. But aside from that, she said that she felt like it must be very similar to being in the military, because you work with a small group of people. you have the opportunity to experience and witness unusual experiences that ordinary people won't get to see in their lifetime. And we train, and there's still that the adrenaline rush of turning out to an incident. And so I applied, fortunately enough to get through first time. And I was completely open and honest about my medical history in terms of my transplant. But although I had to start again from scratch, I built myself back up, and I was just as fit as I was, if not fitter, than years ago. And I passed out in the start of 2019, and I've loved it ever since. It's coming up to 6 years now. I am now an incident commander, so I've recently gone through the process for promotion, and I work at a busy city centre fire station where, as you know, it's not just fire calls we respond to, it's fire and rescue. So we respond to a whole variety of incidents, and we assist the ambulance service as well and the police with gain and entry incidents, road traffic collisions. And because of the city centre suburb that I work in, it's a really tough area, rough part of Manchester. But it's a fantastic area to be a firefighter because there's so much going on. And I absolutely love it. And I wouldn't change it for any other job in the world.
So talk me through the process, mate, because we're here in Australia and like you obviously apply, you go through your interview panel, and how long's academy for, and what's the what is the training that's involved to then, pass out and graduate?
Yes, so initially it is you have to register for what's called a taster day, and you will attend a fire station, and they will run through a series of physical and manual dexterity tests. And once you've attended one of those, you will qualify for a written application form. And the written application form is just your previous experience and competency-based questions. At that stage, if you're successful, you'll be invited down to a selection day where you will have to climb a ladder. There is a couple of fitness assessments. There is a casualty drag. There's a manual dexterity test where you will assemble couplings of a pump. And there's a big emphasis on being able to follow a brief accurately into the T, because as we know, if you get a brief to go into a building that's on fire, you have to be able to retain that information and follow that instruction to the T. And if you're successful on the selection day, you will then go to a series of interviews. And the interviews really are based on your application form. So they will say, tell us about a time in your life where you've had to overcome adversity or work in a team. And they want to see that you've done your research on the makeup of the organisation, of the service. Then the recruits course, or the training school as we call it, or the academy, it's 18 weeks.
Oh wow,
18 weeks long, but it's not residential. If it was it used to be residential, and I do think that would be my preferred option, because there's a lot of firefighters now, and you will know better than most people, especially here in the UK. They're young adults with not a lot of life experience. Not always a bad thing. I completely appreciate they bring a different skill set to the fire appliance, But just turning out on a job in the middle of the night to an RTC in the the pissing down rain on the side of a motorway, the sleep deprivation, it affects people differently. Obviously, as you know.
Yeah. So I'm laughing, Andy, because I know exactly what you mean. And it's the work ethic is different. It's just a very different now with today's generation.
Yeah, and I personally I would rather take somebody that is below the standard but has a good attitude, because again, as you'll know, a large proportion of the job is working with people that you might not agree with their point of view, but you have to be able to get along with people, and you have to be able to put a shift in. The worst thing that can happen as a firefighter is to be labelled lazy. And so there's just that work and graft ethic when you're tired, and you've come back from a big job, and you're filthy and tired, and it's 3 o'clock in the morning, but you can't go to sleep because you've got equipment to clean and you have to be ready to redeploy. And I think you can't teach that on training school, not in the day when you've had a full night's kip and you've got a full meal in your stomach and you're fresh. So that's where I think the residential element would be useful.
Well, it's different to your army days, mate, where you're having rations in Afghanistan, and as you say, some nights you can have a full kip and go to sleep. Like, and young people are having a whinge, going, "This sucks," and it's like, and that's where your lived experience. You can go, well, try going, with no food, and like having bullets fly at you, like that. That's the biggest whinging, like you guys don't know you're alive.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it was a steep learning curve for me, because there's certainly a lot of transferable skills, but it's a completely different job. And there's we sort of say that we are a jack of all trades, master of none, because there is so many areas that you don't have to know everything, but you have to be able to you have to have some knowledge from. We now have an MTA capability, so there's only our service and London where if we have a terrorist related incident, we will support the police now in the warm zone, in triaging casualties, and then you have water rescues from height, your building fires, hazardous material incidents. There's so much that I would say that the information retention is more than being a soldier. And now I'm in a position where I'm leading people. People are looking to me for decisions and answers, and I like that it challenges me, because again, although I feel like I feel like I've lived twice. I'm at a position in my life where it was good to be a beginner again and learn and look up to the senior end, and just be completely humble that we all bring different experiences into this job. But I was under no illusion that I'm a complete amateur again. And that involved me learning the job, and making sure that I develop myself, so that I'm in a position now where people are looking at me. And we had quite a significant job 2 days ago, which I know we spoke about offline. And it was the first time where it was a commercial building that was well alight. And I was very conscious of the roof collapsing. But early on, when we tried to fight the fire, I had an opportunity where I was to put one of my probationers into to have a BA wear, and she only has a few months in the job, but I wanted her to experience her first significant fire. And it was the first time as a commander where you have that real responsibility of their safety is everything to me. And I'm responsible for their safety and for developing them as a firefighter. And, it's almost like looking after one of your children. And so she had that experience, and it was controlled. And she went into that building with a senior BA wearer, and I was glad of that. But I was very aware of, this is on me now. I take complete ownership for all of the decisions that I make on the fireground. So it's good to be a beginner again.
Oh, mate, it is. And I know you and I have spoken off air, and exactly, I'm the same as a crew leader. When I was a firefighter, it was my safety. I put my safety first when I was a firefighter, but now that I'm a crew leader, my safety's last, and I want to get my crew home to their families. And the best piece of advice I ever got from an older crew leader when I first came through, he said, Adam, now your job starts that you are a young firefighter. The best advice you can give is to a young firefighter is to how to become an old firefighter. And that stuck with me because, like that's it, Andy. It's we've got to train the younger ones to become, when we finish, that, we're still, because as you know, it's a dangerous job. Like, so many things can go wrong, and there's so many elements to, it's not just, we run into a burning building and we hope we come out. There's a lot of thought process that goes into, suppressing that fire to just that building, and that's what it is. And I know exactly what you mean, because you learn a lot about yourself when you take those leadership roles on.
Yeah, absolutely. And fortunately for us being in the city, where the second appliance is only normally a few minutes away. So I know that might be different for you in a more less built up area. So we fortunately we have that one advantage.
Absolutely. And for you, mate, as you said, emergency personnel see so much trauma, and they're exposed to so many, a different range and variety of jobs. How do you now, like, with what you've seen from being a veteran and your military experience, how do you cope with that trauma now? Are you better equipped now with tools that you've worked on from where you are mentally now to cope with that, those situations?
Yeah, absolutely. And I see that as a valuable tool that I can help others in the fire service deal with those feelings if they have a particular difficult job. For me personally, and as we know, mental health is so complex. My problems really was related to the feeling of going to die imminently. The trauma side of it, I've been okay with, and so that's something that I can help with. But I absolutely in a position where I know myself better. I know myself better, and I know that if I'm not sleeping properly, if my drinking increases, then if I start having intrusive thoughts, then I know that I'm not right. And so I know those triggers to look out for. The only thing I can't seem to shake is on Bonfire Night in the UK, the 5th of November, is fireworks. I just can't seem to shake the emotional response, the physiological response I have to that. And the mind is such a interesting and complex, such a complex thing, because I can look at the firework, and I know I'm not in danger, but it's more if it's a certain pitch or a certain sound, or if it catches me off guard, I can't seem to shake that. So we have a veterans network within the fire service, which is brilliant. And it was something I was fortunate enough to help start up in the early days. And we just thought that there's quite a lot of veterans now in our brigade, and veterans will always open up to veterans, and a lot of the time there might have been similar experiences. So why not have a support network there? And we do everything from going out for a few beers to raising money for charity. I've recently just come back from a battlefield tour in Belgium with the network, but as part of a reasonable adjustment in work, they allow me to adjust my time off, so that, especially in the city, where on some of the estates they will target the fire appliance with fireworks. In the 6 years that I've been in, I've not had to work a bonfire night. And I just don't, nothing drastic would happen, but I just don't want to put myself in that position. And they've been really, really understanding actually with that. So that's a really positive thing that they've done.
Absolutely. And mate, there's certain things that you'll never shake. And like you say, mate, from where you were to where you are now, mate, I was, as you and I connected, it was like I was reading part of my own story in your story. And, I really connected with your story. And that's why I wanted to get you on the podcast, because, mate, it's the post-traumatic growth that you've had to where you were to wanting to end your life to where you are now. That's the light, mate. That's what it is. You're showing people that, and I see it, mate. I see how passionate you are about getting those statistics, and exactly like me, mate, we lose far too many people who feel that, they can't go on, and just if they have that support to know that they're not alone, and I can see it in you, mate. Like, I see how passionate you are, and it's exactly the same purpose as me, that you want to help others, and that's what it's all about.
Yeah, and like you have an extraordinary story yourself, Adam, and I just think that we're in a lucky position here where we've come through something so significant, and we have a voice and we have experience, and we're in a position where we can actually help somebody. And I just with the book, that's what I thought. If it helps one person, then it's worth it. It's absolutely worth it. And what I've found recently is so many people are reaching out to me who have had similar experiences, and I've always said that there's nothing special about my experiences, but it is unique to me. I know so many women and men that have had horrific experiences, and it's unique to them. So if anybody will give me a platform to talk about the importance of reaching out for help and having a support network, then I'll absolutely continue to do that.
Absolutely, mate. And I wanted to ask you, mate, in that journey of where you've grown and come through that, as I said, the post-traumatic growth, in those really, really dark times, and you mentioned Louise earlier on in the podcast and your son, how important have they been in the journey to get to where you are now?
Yeah, so like I say, I was not expecting to meet anybody, and it's only when I think back that Louise sort of came into my life, because I was still lost to a point, and I didn't really think I was ever going to meet anybody else. And what she taught me, really, and her family, was how important a support network are, And I know I mentioned it earlier on, but I didn't really have any idea of what a family was supposed to be like. Um, they're so close as a family, and they all help each other out. And this was all a new experience to me, and it definitely took a bit of getting used to, because really at heart I'm a bit of a loner, and she they just gave me that support network, and she gave me that confidence to reach out to people, to prioritize some of the relationships that I'd let slip maybe over the years. Because when I first left the Parachute Regiment, I disconnected from everybody for years. And I always had this idea of, I don't need anybody. I will take care of myself. And in that way, nobody can let me down. So yeah, she really instilled those family values in me, and the importance of having a support network. And she's been so understanding, because she didn't sign up for this. She didn't sign up to get, you know, we were never together when I was in the military. So this is all a new experience for her. So she's been very understanding, very supportive with the book. There were periods of the book where I was down for days at a time. And I just said, look, I'm just writing a particularly difficult section of the book. And it does have an impact on you, because I'm trying my very best to articulate how I was feeling at the time.
Mm.
And there's no way of doing that without taking yourself back there in your mind. And so she's been understanding, and there are times where there's been, jobs that need to get done around the house, and instead I've spent a day writing and editing and doing research and not really been there. So yeah, she's been really important, and I still have a very close relationship with my sister as well.
Absolutely. And mate, I know exactly what you're talking about, because there was times in my book where I'd be yelling at the screen, like as I'm typing, I would be, I'd be crying. There's so many mixed emotions in, as you say, and we'll get to that in a minute in the book, but you're right, that support network, and this, Andy, this is what the podcast is about, is to let people know that they're not alone, that there is support out there, and that, just as you said, when you were at your lowest point, and I know my lowest point as well, put your hand up and say, I'm not okay and I need help, and break that stigma down that it's not weak to speak. It's actually a sign of strength. And you and I wouldn't be here if either one of us hadn't put our hands up when we did and said, hey, we need help.
Yeah, and I for a long time, I didn't consider, I wouldn't say I consider myself a victim, but I let some of the things that happened in the past dictate my emotions and some of the relationships I formed. It was a very big part of who I was, but recently I've reframed that, and I've turned it on the head, and I've actually think to myself, well, it's actually an advantage now, because I know there's the old cliche of, you've survived 100% of your worst days so far. And I think, well, actually, it's a blessing, because I'm now in a position where I'm better equipped to help myself and other people. So I don't think that I'm a victim in any sense of the word. I'm grateful for those experiences, and that I've come through it the other side, and I'm in a position now where hopefully I can help somebody.
Absolutely, mate. Absolutely. It's a really amazing thing when, you have total random people just reach out to you and say, Andy, your book has just inspired me to change, or, and that's what it's about. And mate, we're nearly getting to the end of the podcast, and there's a few final questions that I want to ask you in both the sense of if someone's looking to join and go into the para regiment and also first responder, like become like whether it's police, fire, ambulance, what advice would you give to these people who are looking to go down either the military or the first responder path?
Yeah. So one of the key lessons that I used to teach when I was running hostile environment awareness courses for civilians going into area conflict, and that was your prior planning and preparation. So one thing that's going to give you an advantage is you need to do as much preparation and planning as you can before you put your hand up or before you start that process. And that can be from the online information, certainly from a firefighter perspective, go down and visit the stations and talk to the firefighters. So you're planning and preparation, first of all. You need to prioritize your own health and well-being. You have to be physically fit and you have to be mentally robust. And I think it's probably something that I would have advised my younger self would be prioritize self-care and your health and well-being, because without your health well-being, you have nothing. So your plan and preparation, so you are better equipped to know what you're going into. You need to be physically fit, because there are times, especially in the fire service, if it's persons reported and you're searching for a casualty in a burning building, you do not want to be that person that is struggling because you've not maintained your fitness and you've not looked after yourself. And one of the things I learned way back at 16, when the para training depot became so difficult with the long days and the beastings out on the yard, was that no matter what they can do to you physically, if you are mentally strong, you're untouchable. And I said to myself that I don't care what they do to me physically. If I have to, run round that tree another 3 times with a respirator on, or I have to do more press ups or more physical punishment, as long as I'm mentally strong, they can't. I'm untouchable. So definitely work on yourself, both physically and mentally, and your preparation and your planning before you go there, so you know what you're expecting.
Absolutely. And mate, for you, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give your 18-year-old self? And do you think he'd listen, looking back now of where you are and all you've gone through in your life?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Adam. So I'd probably say, well, going back to what I just said, definitely prioritize self-care. You need to look after yourself. You need to look after yourself. And I think along with that would be to put more of an emphasis on some of the relationships you've formed. I very much had a mentality of, I don't need or want anything from anybody. I'll do it on my own. And it's really a bad mindset to have, because when things do go wrong, it is that support network that is going to help you and looking after yourself. So, I'd probably say focus on building good relationships with people, because people are fascinating, and you will know, just like me, because of some of the amazing people that you get to have a conversation with. Everybody has their own story, and everyone has something to offer, and you're not in it alone. And I'd probably the final thing I'd say would be to focus on developing and growing yourself, and don't be afraid of change. I lost so much of my identity when I left the military. It was all I knew. It was all I ever wanted to do, and it was a very daunting experience starting again at such a young age in the civilian world. So I'd say embrace change, because change isn't always a bad thing. There are plenty of opportunities. It's not always a bad thing. So yeah, that'd probably be my advice to my younger self. Whether or not I would listen to that advice, I'm not sure. I'm not sure at that age, because I was just brainwashed with being a paratrooper. And it wasn't until later on in life that I think I didn't realize the impact of some of my childhood experiences that had on me when it come to forming relationships and dealing with traumatic experiences.
Absolutely. And mate, I won't, you've sort of answered my next question of, I was going to ask you about, was joining the military the best decision, but you answered that just then. But as we said throughout the podcast, recently you published your best-selling autobiography, Beyond the Drop Zone, a paratrooper's story. Congratulations, mate, and well done on the hard work. And as a fellow author, I know exactly the hard work it is to publish a book, mate. And so, mate, with that, you've spoken about throughout the podcast, it was a cathartic experience, but was there times when you were writing that you wanted to actually give up and that you just thought, I'm not going to finish this book?
Yeah, absolutely, Adam. Because I left school without any qualifications, it was something I really had to work at. And because I published it as an independent author, the voice in your head of self-worth would always gnaw at me. And I thought, well, who am I to write a book? Will it be good enough? Well, who's going to want to read it? And, I'm not a writer. And I suppose I applied the same obsessive behaviors of, that's probably why it took so many years. And then the more that I did it, the same with everything, the more I become comfortable with it. And I had a few endorsements from some established authors that helped give me a bit of a confidence boost, just to tell me that, look, the writing quality is good. Just keep doing what you're doing. And then ultimately I thought, well, the book isn't about selling loads of copies. The book was something for me to give to my son and to my family. And so it doesn't matter if it's not good, because it's my experiences for decades to come. The Iraq and the Afghan campaigns, they won't be spoken about, and they won't be as well known as they recently are. Just like the campaign, just like the Bosnia conflict for the UK and the Falklands before that, and the Korean War and all the rest of it. So the book was for two reasons. It was to give those young lads two reasons for the book. One was the young lads in their early 20s, and they died all over, but more personally to me, I watched young lads die in front of my eyes. Young lads that were fighting a war thousands of miles away that doesn't mean anything anymore. So, and they're so young. And then the growing number of guys I know that have taken their lives since we came back for various reasons. I was one of the lucky ones to be given a second chance in life. So I wanted their voices in the book and their names and their stories. And then the second reason was for my son, because I thought, I mean, I didn't know any of my grandparents. I don't know anything about my mother's side, but from my dad's side, they both died before I was born. And I thought, do you know what? If one of my grandparents had written a book, even if it was a terrible book, I would absolutely love to read it because it's a snapshot in time. And so I decided on that hospital bed that for better or for worse, I was going to publish it.
And mate, we spoke off air, of how daunting it is and scary when you put it out to the world and people, they're going to judge it regardless. But mate, I've read it. It's a fantastic read. And one thing that I want to touch on, and you just mentioned it with the lads that were killed over there. That's why the ode is so important, mate. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. And that's what they are, mate. They're that age that they're in their 20s or they're 19 or those are the ages that they will never be like they were that age that when they died. And that's why it's so important that we are capturing this history, mate, of exactly what you said, capturing this history of the podcast, having their voices in the book, and not doing it at an age, Andy, where, we made that mistake back in with the First World War, the Second World War, where we got your memories later on in life when your memories are little bit more foggy. And now this is the perfect time to capture when it's still fresh. It's still, you're in your late 30s going into your 40s. It's still vivid now, and it's not a forgetting memory of when you're in your 70s and 80s.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose just the my personal circumstances gave me that push to get it done and put the hard work in, and it is a lot of hard work, as you know, as you're well aware. And I am so glad that I'm so thankful that I did do it, because I didn't want to die, and all those experiences. My son had no idea of the things that I was involved with, and the people, the experiences that have shared some of that journey with me in the military specifically. So, and I would recommend it to anybody. I would recommend it to anybody writing, even if you don't publish the book, you can just journal or diary and something you can give your family or your children, because it's a win-win, because it's very cathartic. Certainly, it's certainly therapeutic just to organize those thoughts, and it's something to give to your family.
Absolutely, mate. And I recommend it to any veteran or first responder or anybody that, just get it down. Just, it doesn't matter if it's never published, but it's just something for your family. And absolutely, mate. Absolutely, 100% agree. And mate, for what are your plans going forward in now that you've written the book? And what are your plans with Louise and your son? And what do you want to do into the future now, career-wise as well?
Yeah, so I recently, as we said, I've recently been promoted in the fire service, so I'm throwing myself at that and all of the endless learning that comes from that. I I have actually outlined the foundations of a second book, which I don't know when I'll get around to doing it. I will certainly started the outlines of it. I'm very excited about it, and it is around some of the lessons that I've learned. I've always had a fascination in psychology. I studied it for a number of years, and I would like to link some of the studies out there with around resilience and mindset, and link it to some of my own experiences and put it out there for people to read and hopefully help them. So hopefully I can get started on that soon, and I will, to anybody that will listen to me, I will keep being an advocate for mental health and looking out for each other.
Absolutely, mate. And as I say, it's an absolute get out and buy Andy's book. It's a phenomenal read. I absolutely loved every minute of it. And mate, I'm just so glad that our paths have crossed. And mate, I look forward to getting over to the UK next year. And a good friend of both of ours, Liz McConney, that's I don't think I've butchered that. So, but yeah, mate, I look forward to catching up with you both and having a beer next year. So definitely looking forward to catching up with you, mate, in person. And mate, how do people get in contact with you if they want to reach out?
Yeah, so I am mostly on Instagram, in terms of social media. So Beyond the Drop Zone is my handle. There's my son actually manages a TikTok account for me. I'm still getting my head around creating reels and trying to promote the book. And I would just say to anybody that if anybody is struggling and it's something that I can advise or help on, although I'm not a professional, I'm more than happy to speak to anybody, message anybody, and do what I can just to make sure that people are prioritizing looking after themselves and not becoming another statistic.
Absolutely, mate. 100% echo that. And Andy, it's been an absolute just epic story, mate. To have you on has been an absolute privilege. And I'm going to finish with this, mate. Andy, you've served your country with honour and brought pride to your family. As I said, your story is one of true grit, determination, never giving up, and facing death and the Grim Reaper many, many times and saying, no, fuck off, I've got work to do. And I say that, fuck off, I've got work to do. And your work's not done, mate. And mate, thank you. You're an absolute inspiration to all of us, mate. You served in the military. You're now serving as a first responder, as a firefighter. And mate, as I say, it's just been an absolute honour and a privilege to have you on True Blue Conversations. So Andy Williams, thank you for coming on True Blue Conversations.
Thanks, Adam, and once again, it's been an honour to have a conversation with you. So thanks for having me on.
Welcome, loyal listeners of True Blue Conversations. Today's episode is proudly sponsored by Australian Warfighter Coffee. Veteran owned and run, driven by a simple yet powerful motto: people over profit. Every dollar goes towards supporting veterans and first responder charity groups. Head on over to AustralianWarfighters.com and use the code TrueBlue for your exclusive discount. Because let's face it, any other coffee is just brown sadness water. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of True Blue Conversations with your host, Adam Bloom. See you on the front line.